Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we are easing into a subject that can feel uncomfortably close to home, even if it usually arrives in conversation wearing a very sensible lab coat and carrying statistics nobody asked for at bedtime. We are talking about heart attacks, and more specifically, the unsettling fact that they do not always restrict themselves to the people we imagine they should. We like our illnesses neat. We like cause and effect to line up politely. We prefer to believe that if a person eats reasonably well, goes for walks, has decent blood test results, and does not treat cigarettes as a food group, then the heart in gratitude will simply continue its work without drama. It would be lovely if biology were that tidy. It is not. The heart is diligent, loyal, and usually quite hard-working, but it is not sentimental, and it does not always obey our common assumptions about who is safe and who is not. Before we wander any further into this, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you tucked up in bed under a heavy blanket, sitting in a chair with one sock on and one sock mysteriously elsewhere, or half listening from a train, a sofa, or the kitchen, while pretending you only came in for water? And what time is it where you are? There is something oddly grounding about knowing that a conversation about the human body is floating out across different rooms, different cities, different time zones, while all those hearts keep beating away in their usual patient style, not waiting for us to catch up with the details. If this kind of gentle biological wandering helps you unwind, settle your thoughts, or simply gives your brain something calmer to hold than the usual parade of unfinished tasks and minor social regrets from 2017, I would be very grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and stayed a while. It helps this quiet little corner of science reach more people who might need a slower, steadier kind of explanation. And now, with no rush at all, let us move toward the question that sits at the center of tonight's story. Why do seemingly healthy people still have heart attacks? Why does a person who looks well, feels mostly well, and may even be held up by friends and family as the healthy one, sometimes end up in an emergency room with a heart muscle suddenly starved of blood? Part of the trouble begins with the word healthy. It is one of those words we use constantly and define rather lazily. Healthy might mean someone is not visibly unwell. It might mean they are slim. It might mean they run on weekends, own a water bottle large enough to qualify as camping equipment, and can discuss magnesium with the seriousness of a medieval scholar. It might mean their blood pressure was fine last spring. It might mean they are younger than the people we mentally place in the heart attack category. Sometimes it simply means they do not match our stereotype of illness, and stereotypes, while occasionally useful for guessing who ate the last biscuit, are not a sound foundation for medical reality. The human body is less like a showroom and more like an old busy city. Plenty can be happening behind the walls while the front looks perfectly respectable. Roads can narrow, pipes can stiffen, signals can misfire, repair crews can be delayed, one district can look polished and prosperous, while another has been quietly struggling for years. The same goes for the cardiovascular system. A person can appear fit, capable, energetic, productive, and outwardly well while changes are developing inside blood vessels that do not announce themselves with drums, banners, or even a particularly useful email. Arteries are not known for their communication skills. They do not clear their throats and say, "Just a quick note before tomorrow, the inner lining has become irritated and we have concerns." They tend to remain silent right up to the point where silence stops being possible. This is one of the more difficult things for people to accept. Heart disease is often imagined as a problem that gives lots of warning to the right kind of patient, by which people usually mean an older man who is visibly unfit, perhaps angry at traffic, perhaps carrying a breakfast of regrettable enthusiasm. There is some truth buried somewhere in that stereotype in the sense that certain risk factors do increase risk. Age matters, smoking matters, diabetes matters, high blood pressure matters, high LDL cholesterol matters, lack of movement matters, excess body fat, especially in certain patterns, can matter. That much is straightforward enough. but the body does not read public health pamphlets and then assign events with theatrical fairness. Risk is not destiny, and low visible risk is not immunity. A heart attack, in the simplest terms, happens when blood flow to part of the heart muscle is blocked enough and long enough to injure or kill that tissue. The heart, which is busy keeping everyone else alive, is itself dependent on a network of coronary arteries wrapped around it like dedicated supply lines. When one of those supply lines becomes suddenly obstructed, the muscle downstream begins to suffer. Time matters, oxygen matters, cells begin to falter, electrical stability can become shaky. Pain may appear, or pressure, or something much vaguer and harder to interpret. It is a dramatic event, yes, but in many cases the groundwork for that drama was laid down slowly, quietly, and without much respect for appearances. That slowness is important. Many people think of a heart attack as something that begins in one terrible moment. In another sense, it can begin years earlier. It can begin in the inner lining of an artery when that lining becomes more vulnerable to injury. It can begin when cholesterol-containing particles move into the artery wall and get stuck there. It can begin when the immune system, doing what it is designed to do, reacts to that situation and creates inflammation. It can begin when a plaque forms, not the sort that sits on teeth and causes lectures from dentists, but a fatty, inflamed structure inside the vessel wall. That plaque may not block the artery completely. In fact, one of the more unnerving details is that some dangerous plaques are not necessarily the biggest or the most obvious. A person may not have a vessel that is dramatically narrowed in a way that would impress an anatomy textbook. What they may have is a plaque that is unstable, and unstable things have a way of behaving badly at inconvenient times. A plaque can sit there for years, causing little or no noticeable trouble, and then one day its surface can rupture or erode. Once that happens, the body treats the area as an injury. Platelets rush in, a clot begins to form. This would be helpful if you had cut your finger. Inside a coronary artery, it is far less charming. The clot can rapidly reduce or stop blood flow. The event then feels sudden, even though the biological setup was anything but sudden. So when people say, "it came out of nowhere," what they often mean is that it came out of nowhere they could see. That distinction matters because visible health and internal stability are not always the same thing. Someone can be active and still carry inherited cholesterol disorders. Someone can be thin and still have high blood pressure. Someone can have normal standard checkups and still have inflammatory processes developing beneath the radar of casual medical attention. Someone can eat what is generally considered a good diet and still be under chronic stress, sleep badly, have poorly controlled blood sugar, or have a strong family history that changes the odds in ways a mirror cannot reveal. There are also people who have never been told their cholesterol is high because they have not been tested recently, or at all, or because one normal number years ago was treated as a lifelong certificate of arterial virtue. Then there is the problem of what we notice versus what we do not. Human beings are very good at using visible cues as shortcuts. We see body size, age, fitness level, skin tone, social image, energy and confidence. We use all of that to make fast judgments. Medicine, unfortunately for our shortcuts, is full of hidden variables. You can look lean and have metabolic dysfunction. You can look strong and have elevated lipoprotein A, a genetically influenced particle associated with increased cardiovascular risk. You can look young and have an inherited disorder affecting cholesterol handling. You can look calm and live in a constant state of poor sleep, overwork and low-level physiological strain. You can look absolutely splendid in holiday photos and still have coronary disease developing in the background like a very unwelcome side plot. Fitness itself, helpful though it is, can also mislead people into thinking it offers absolute protection. Exercise is powerful. It improves blood pressure, insulin sensitivity, vascular function, body composition, mood, sleep, and a long list of other things that make life more manageable and the heart more resilient. But exercise is not a magical shield issued by the universe. in exchange for dutiful use of a treadmill. A person can be fit and still carry risk from genetics, smoking history, stimulant use, untreated hypertension, inflammatory disease, or plaque that has already formed over many years. The fit person may start from a better position overall, and often does, but biology does not deal in guarantees. It deals in probabilities, mechanisms, trade-offs, and sometimes rude surprises. That is one reason stories of heart attacks in healthy people feel so shocking. They violate a comforting narrative. We want control to be simple. We want the rules to be visible. We want virtue to be rewarded in straight lines. Eat this, avoid that, walk briskly, think optimistic thoughts, and all shall be well. Yet the cardiovascular system lives at the intersection of many forces: genes, inflammation, blood pressure, blood lipids, hormones, stress responses, sleep quality, environmental exposures, infections, activity levels, diet patterns, medical care, chance timing, and the basic wear of being a living mammal for a number of decades. Even when someone is doing many things right, there may be one important factor that has been missed, or one hidden process moving more quietly than expected. There is another layer here, and it has to do with symptoms or the lack of them. People often assume that if their heart were in danger, they would know. Surely the body would issue a clear, dramatic warning with enough notice to cancel appointments and perhaps adopt a more grateful attitude toward leafy greens. Sometimes it does. There can be chest pressure, heaviness, squeezing, pain radiating into the arm, jaw, back, or upper abdomen, shortness of breath, nausea, sweating, unusual fatigue, or a sense that something is very wrong. But symptoms can also be subtle, intermittent, misread, or attributed to indigestion, anxiety, muscle strain, menopause, stress, poor sleep, a heavy meal, or simply getting older. Some people, particularly women, are more likely to have symptoms that do not fit the popular image of the dramatic chest-clutching scene. The body is not always theatrical. Quite often it is vague, and vague symptoms are easy to postpone. That postponement becomes easier when the person thinks, "This cannot be my heart. I'm healthy." It is a powerful sentence, and not always a helpful one. It can delay evaluation. It can make friends and family minimize symptoms. It can cause clinicians at times to initially think in other directions if the patient does not match the classic template. And by the time the truth has become obvious, valuable time may have passed. So part of tonight's topic is not just biological, but psychological. The idea of being healthy can sometimes protect us from panic, which is useful, but it can also protect us from reality, which is less useful when the heart is trying to lodge a formal complaint. Now, none of this means that healthy habits are pointless. Quite the opposite. They matter enormously. The risk reductions associated with not smoking, controlling blood pressure, managing cholesterol, staying active, sleeping decently, eating well, and treating diabetes are real and meaningful. Most heart attacks are not random bolts from a clear sky. They are linked to identifiable processes and risk factors, even when those factors are not immediately visible to ordinary life. The important point is simply that health is not a costume, and risk is not something you can judge reliably from appearances alone. A person may look well and still have vulnerability. Another may look unwell by society's superficial standards and be much safer than assumed. Biology has no interest in our moral rankings or aesthetic guesses. It helps perhaps to think of risk the way one might think of weather. A bright morning does not guarantee no storm later. A cloudy sky does not mean catastrophe is certain. Conditions matter. Patterns matter. Pressure systems matter. What happened last week matters. What is moving in from elsewhere matters. And sometimes, despite all the available information, the exact timing of an event still catches people off guard. The heart, like weather, operates through systems interacting over time. You do not understand a thunderstorm by staring only at the tree that got struck. You have to look at the atmosphere that made it possible. In the same way, when a healthy-seeming person has a heart attack, The right response is not to shrug and call it pure bad luck, nor to become so frightened that every skipped heartbeat feels like a signed invitation to disaster. The more useful response is curiosity. What was happening underneath? Which risk factors were visible and which were hidden? Was there genetic predisposition? Was there untreated or unrecognized high cholesterol, high blood pressure, inflammation, sleep apnea, chronic stress? Diabetes that had not yet announced itself loudly enough? A clotting tendency? A history that seemed unimportant until suddenly it was not? These are the sorts of questions that move us away from myth and toward mechanism. Mechanism is comforting in its own quiet way, not because it makes everything preventable, but because it makes events less mysterious. And less mystery means more opportunity to notice, test, treat, and protect. If the story were simply that healthy people sometimes drop without reason, there would be very little to do except worry in an unproductive manner. Worry, as you may have discovered, loves a vacuum and is terribly inventive when given one. But that is not the actual story. The actual story is that the label healthy often hides complexity. The actual story is that arteries can change silently. The actual story is that the event may be sudden, while the biology leading up to it is not. The actual story is that risk can sit quietly in family history, blood chemistry, sleep patterns, inflammation, and vessel walls long before it turns up as a crisis. And so, we begin here, not with panic, but with a correction. Healthy looking is not the same as protected. Feeling fine is not the same as having no disease. A normal routine is not the same as a full picture. The heart does not care much for public image, and it certainly does not pause to ask whether a person has been trying very hard. It responds to structure, chemistry, pressure, flow, timing, and the long accumulation of influences that shape the inner life of the arteries. Once you accept that, the topic stops being a cruel contradiction and starts becoming something more understandable, if still a bit unnerving, because the first real surprise is not that heart attacks can happen in people who seem healthy. The first real surprise is how much can be going on in the coronary arteries before anyone feels a thing, and how often the trouble remains quiet while ordinary life carries on above it, making breakfast, answering emails, buying avocados with ambition, and assuming the body would surely send a clearer memo if something serious were developing, when in fact the silence is part of the problem, and the arteries, as we are about to see, are often at their most dangerous when they seem to be saying nothing at all. One of the most misleading ideas in everyday health is the belief that healthy and safe mean the same thing. They do not. They overlap, often quite a lot, and that is part of why the confusion lasts so well, but they are not identical. A person can be healthy in the ordinary sense of the word and still carry a level of cardiovascular risk that is real, active, and not especially interested in appearances. They may look well, function well, and feel well. They may have stamina, sensible habits, respectable lab numbers, and the kind of shopping basket that makes strangers assume they probably own chia seeds. And still, somewhere inside the vessel supplying the heart, the conditions for serious trouble may already exist. This is not because the idea of health is useless. It is because the word is far too broad for the job people give it. In normal conversation, healthy can mean almost anything flattering. It can mean slim. It can mean active. It can mean younger than expected. It can mean not taking regular medication. It can mean not having been admitted to hospital recently. It can mean someone who posts morning walks, eats grilled fish on purpose, and has strong opinions about sleep hygiene while also checking emails at 11:47 p.m. It can mean someone who is not obviously ill, and that last one, more than anything else, is where the trouble begins. We are very good at sorting people visually. The body, inconveniently, does not always provide its most important information through the methods of fashion, body language, or public image. Cardiovascular disease develops through biological processes that are often quiet for years. A person does not need to look unwell for damage to accumulate in the inner lining of the arteries. They do not need to feel tired for cholesterol-containing particles to move into the vessel wall. They do not need to gain weight for inflammation to be active. They do not need to be old for inherited risk to be shaping their future. Safety is not a mood, it is not a vibe, it is not the general impression one gives while opening a jar without assistance. Safety depends on specific conditions in the body, and those conditions are not always visible from the outside. It helps to separate two questions that people often blur together. The first is, does this person seem healthy in daily life? The second is, how likely is this person to experience a serious cardiovascular event? Those questions can point in the same direction, but they do not have to. A person may seem robust, energetic, and physically capable while carrying risk factors they do not know about. Another may look less impressive by society's superficial standards and yet have more stable arteries, lower inflammation, better blood pressure, and far less immediate risk. The body keeps its own records, and they are not always available for casual inspection. Part of the misunderstanding comes from the way prevention is discussed. Public health advice is necessarily simplified. Do not smoke, stay active, eat well, keep blood pressure under control, manage cholesterol, sleep enough. Try not to live entirely on stress and vending machine food. This is good advice. It saves lives. But when people hear it repeatedly, they sometimes convert it into a more absolute belief than it was ever meant to be. They start to think of healthy habits as a certificate of protection, rather than a reduction of probability. The difference between those two ideas is enormous. Reduction of probability is how biology works. Certificate of protection is how people wish it worked. A person who does many things right usually does lower their risk, often substantially. But lowered risk is not zero risk. That can feel unfair, because it is unfair in the way most biology is unfair. The body responds to many inputs at once, and some of them are inherited, some are hidden, and some are only partly controllable. A person can exercise regularly and still have high LDL cholesterol. They can eat carefully and still have elevated lipoprotein A, which is strongly influenced by genetics. They can avoid smoking and still develop hypertension. They can be slim and still have insulin resistance. They can be young and still have a family history that shifts the odds dramatically. They can be female and dismissed because their risk is assumed to be low until a crisis proves otherwise. None of this means healthy habits do not matter. It means habits exist inside a wider system. Then there is the awkward matter of what counts as healthy in the first place. Most people assess it through a loose combination of body size, energy, age, and lifestyle shorthand. We are surprisingly comforted by visible discipline. If someone runs, we assume health. If they carry a gym bag, we assume safety. If they order salad without behaving resentfully, we practically award them a cardiac halo. Yet even exercise, for all its powerful benefits, does not erase pre-existing plaque, inherited lipid disorders, clotting tendencies, sleep apnea, autoimmune inflammation, or the effects of years of uncontrolled blood pressure. It improves many things. It can stabilize many things. It is one of the best tools available, but it is not a magical amnesty for every risk already in motion. This becomes especially important when people are reassured by a single good feature. Someone is thin, therefore healthy. Someone is a cyclist, therefore safe. Someone is too young, therefore not a candidate for heart disease. Someone had one normal checkup 3 years ago, therefore the story is settled. Someone has no symptoms, therefore nothing serious can be happening. These leaps are understandable, but they are not medically reliable. The cardiovascular system is shaped by patterns over time, not by one flattering data point. A low resting heart rate can coexist with high LDL cholesterol. Good muscle tone can coexist with plaque formation. A green smoothie can coexist with a strong genetic predisposition. The body is fully capable of keeping contradictory truths in play at the same time. Another reason healthy and safe get confused is that safety sounds like a binary. Either you are safe or you are not. Either the danger exists or it does not. Biology is much less tidy than that. Cardiovascular risk is distributed along a spectrum. Some people are at very low risk right now. Some are at modest risk. Some are at high risk despite feeling fine. Some are at rising risk because certain factors are beginning to worsen. Some are at lower risk than average but still not immune. Medicine deals in gradients, not simple categories, and the heart is a particularly good example of that. A person may be far safer than someone else, and yet not fully safe. They may have fewer risk factors, and still have one major factor that matters more than all the visible reassuring details. Take family history, for instance. This is one of the most underestimated parts of the puzzle, because it feels old-fashioned and slightly boring compared with modern health culture. People get excited about step counts, cold plunges, supplements, and whether blueberries can be arranged into a moral identity. Family history does not get the same glamorous treatment, yet it can be tremendously important. If close relatives developed cardiovascular disease early, that changes the picture. It does not guarantee the same outcome, but it suggests that the body may have inherited tendencies involving cholesterol handling, vessel biology, blood pressure regulation, clotting, inflammation, or some combination of these. A person can be doing quite a lot right and still be playing on a steeper hill than they realize. The same is true of blood chemistry that remains unseen. Cholesterol is a perfect example, because people often reduce it to a very cartoon version of the truth. Either it is high and terrifying, or normal and irrelevant. In reality, lipid-related risk is shaped by several components, including LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, apolipoprotein B, and particles such as lipoprotein A, which is not always included in routine testing. A person who feels perfectly healthy may never think to ask about these things, especially if they are active and not visibly unwell. They can go for years assuming they're outside the heart disease story simply because no one has yet shown them the numbers that might suggest otherwise. Blood pressure is another quiet operator. It does not always make people feel bad. In fact, one of its least considerate habits is that it can remain elevated for years without producing symptoms strong enough to force attention. During that time, it increases strain on vessel walls, contributes to damage, and raises the likelihood of long-term cardiovascular complications. The person living with it may still seem entirely healthy. They may be productive, cheerful, physically capable, and mildly smug about their morning routine. None of that prevents their arteries from absorbing the cost of pressure that is too high too often. Inflammation complicates the picture even further because it is both essential and potentially harmful. The immune system needs to respond to injury and infection. That is normal. But chronic low-grade inflammation, especially inside the arterial wall, can contribute to plaque formation and instability. This is not the sort of thing most people can feel directly. No one wakes up and says, with admirable precision, "I believe my endothelium is having a difficult month." Inflammation is one of the reasons cardiovascular disease can progress in people who do not match the usual image of illness. Their lives may look orderly on the surface, while deeper biological processes remain unsettled. Stress belongs in this discussion too, though it's often handled poorly. People either dismiss it entirely or speak about it as though it were a mystical force hovering over office workers. In reality, stress affects behavior, hormones, blood pressure, sleep, glucose regulation and inflammatory pathways. Chronic stress does not usually cause a heart attack in isolation, but it can help shape the conditions in which risk grows. A person can appear high-functioning, successful, and physically healthy while living in a state of sustained physiological strain. They may think of themselves as coping. Their cardiovascular system may be filing a different report. Sleep is similarly neglected because people are very talented at boasting about not getting enough of it. Poor sleep affects blood pressure, appetite regulation, insulin sensitivity, inflammation, and overall recovery. Sleep apnea, in particular, is a major and frequently underrecognized cardiovascular risk factor. Some people imagine sleep apnea as a problem reserved for a very narrow stereotype, but it is broader than that. A person can be outwardly healthy, reasonably active, and still spend years with fragmented sleep, intermittent drops in oxygen, and mounting cardiovascular burden. Again, healthy and safe begin drifting apart. Even the phrase "no symptoms" needs careful handling. Absence of symptoms can be reassuring, but only to a point. Many stages of atherosclerosis are silent. The artery wall can be changing long before the heart itself signals distress. And when symptoms do appear, they are not always dramatic or correctly interpreted. Some people feel chest pressure, others feel breathlessness, fatigue, nausea, upper back discomfort, or a vague sense that something is off. People who believe they are healthy are often the quickest to explain symptoms away. They're too young, too active, too careful, too sensible. It must be reflux. It must be stress. It must be that peculiar lunch. This confidence in one's own safety can be oddly dangerous because it delays recognition of the problem. There is also the question of timing. Risk factors do not all operate on the same schedule. Some act slowly over decades, like high LDL cholesterol contributing to plaque buildup. Others may increase the chance that an existing plaque becomes dangerous, like inflammation or a sudden stress response. Still others alter the likelihood of clot formation once a plaque surface is disrupted. The event, when it arrives, feels abrupt, but the person experiencing it may have spent years crossing small biological thresholds without any obvious signal. Their life on the outside remained organized enough to support the identity of a healthy person. The processes on the inside were less impressed. This is why stories about a heart attack in the healthy one feel so unnerving to everyone around them. The story collides with the social role. Every family has versions of these categories. There is the one who worries about food labels, the one who runs, the one who never seems ill, the one the others assume will outlive them all simply by being annoyingly responsible. When that person becomes the patient, it unsettles more than just expectations. It unsettles the quiet bargain people make with the body. I will behave sensibly and you will spare me the frightening surprises. Most of the time that bargain improves the odds. It does not bind nature to perfect obedience. Doctors think in terms of risk, but patients often think in terms of identity. That difference creates trouble. A patient may say, "But I'm healthy," and mean, "I am not the sort of person this should happen to." The body hears none of that. It responds to actual measurements and actual mechanisms. Is the LDL high? Is the blood pressure controlled? Is there diabetes or pre-diabetes? Is there smoking past or present? Is there smoking past or present? Is there sleep apnea? Are there inflammatory diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis or lupus? Is there a family history of early heart disease? Is there chronic kidney disease? Is there persistent stress with poor recovery? Identity is emotionally powerful, but mechanism is what determines what the vessels have been living with. Sometimes the confusion is reinforced by medical systems themselves. Routine care is often built around limited time, broad screening, and the assumption that low-seeming risk people do not need deeper investigation. Many do not, but some do. A person may have borderline numbers that are not taken seriously enough. They may not be screened early because they do not fit a typical profile. Their symptoms may be initially brushed aside because they are active, young, or female. Their family history may be mentioned and forgotten. Their apparently healthy lifestyle may create a sense of safety that dampens further curiosity. By the time the truth is clearer, it may be because the disease has finally become loud enough to be undeniable. And then, of course, there is chance, which is an irritating but real part of medicine. Two people can have similar plaque burdens and different outcomes. One plaque may remain stable for years. Another may rupture next Tuesday while someone is carrying groceries and mentally composing a completely unnecessary but satisfying reply to an email. This does not mean events are random in the sense of having no cause. It means that within a field of risk, timing is not always predictable. The unpredictability is one reason safety is such a dangerous word to overuse. It suggests more certainty than biology can offer. Better words are lower risk, higher risk, more protected, less protected, well controlled, poorly controlled, stable, unstable, known, unknown. These are not as emotionally satisfying. No one wants to say, I am moderately protected but with several variables requiring periodic reassessment. It lacks flair, yet it is closer to the truth. The heart lives in a world of changing conditions, and our understanding of it improves when we trade neat identities for more precise questions. What is known about this person's blood pressure? Lipids, blood sugar, family history, inflammation, sleep, fitness, smoking history, symptoms. These questions do not create certainty, but they create a far better map than simply deciding someone looks healthy. So when healthy is used casually, as it almost always is, it should be heard as a rough surface description, not a guarantee of safety. It may indicate good habits. It may indicate functional strength. It may indicate that a person has fewer obvious problems than someone else. All of that matters, but none of it allows us to ignore what cannot be seen. The body contains hidden histories. Arteries remember years that the mirror forgot. The vessel wall keeps track of pressure, particles, inflammation, and repair in a much more literal way than daily life does. And because so much of that record remains silent for so long, people can keep feeling entirely fine, while the difference between healthy and safe grows wider beneath the surface, which is why the next thing we have to look at is not the person's image, routine, or identity at all, but the arteries themselves, and the remarkable way they can change without making much noise about it. The unsettling part is not only that risk can exist in someone who seems healthy, it is that the main structures involved are often extraordinarily quiet while the risk develops. Arteries do not make a persuasive case for attention. They do not produce dramatic discomfort when their inner environment begins to change. They do not usually complain in the early stages. They do not send the sort of clear warning that people imagine serious disease ought to provide. And because of that silence, one of the most important processes in cardiovascular medicine can unfold while a person is living what feels like an entirely ordinary life. To understand why this happens, it helps to begin with what arteries actually are. They are not just passive tubes carrying blood from place to place, like plumbing installed by a reasonably competent but emotionally unavailable contractor. They are living tissues. Their walls have structure. They respond to pressure, chemical signals, inflammation, hormones, and the mechanical force of blood flow. They can adapt, they can stiffen, they can repair, they can also be injured. The inner lining of an artery, called the endothelium, is especially important. It is very thin, but it does a great deal. It helps regulate vessel tone, controls how substances move in and out of the wall, influences clotting, and communicates with the immune system in ways that are both useful and, under the wrong conditions, rather troublesome. When the endothelium is functioning well, it helps keep the arterial environment stable. It supports smooth blood flow and discourages unnecessary clot formation. But it is not indestructible. Repeated stress from high blood pressure, harmful lipid particles, smoking, diabetes, chronic inflammation, poor metabolic health, and other factors can disturb that lining. Not necessarily in one dramatic moment. Often it is a gradual erosion of stability. The surface becomes more permeable. Certain particles in the blood, particularly those containing apolipoprotein B, including LDL particles, can move into the artery wall and remain there. Once trapped, they can undergo chemical changes that attract the attention of the immune system. That is where the silence begins to do some of its most confusing work, because all of this can happen without producing a sensation a person could easily identify. There is no simple internal alarm for your arterial wall is becoming biologically complicated. If there were, medicine would be much more straightforward and considerably less dependent on blood tests. Instead, the immune system responds locally. White blood cells move in. Macrophages attempt to clear material from the vessel wall. In doing so, they can become engorged with lipids, and turn into what are known as foam cells. Over time, this contributes to the formation of fatty streaks and then more developed atherosclerotic plaques. The process is active, cellular, and deeply consequential. It is also, in most cases, symptomless for a very long time. That word symptomless is one of the most important in this entire story. People tend to imagine that disease announces itself proportionally to its importance. Something minor produces a mild sign. Something major produces a major sign. This would be a very user-friendly arrangement. The body has other priorities. Many dangerous conditions remain quiet while developing because the tissues involved are not equipped to signal the kind of discomfort we would easily interpret, or because the changes do not significantly disrupt function until much later. Arteries, especially coronary arteries, are good examples. Plaque can build over years without blocking enough flow to cause obvious symptoms during normal activity. A person may have a substantial amount of disease by the time the first clue appears, and that clue may come only when the plaque becomes unstable or blood supply is suddenly compromised. There is a tendency to imagine the artery narrowing like a pipe that gradually clogs until eventually nothing can get through. That image is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Early plaque does not always bulge dramatically inward at first. Arteries can remodel. The wall may expand outward in a way that partly preserves the space through which blood flows, so a plaque can be growing and changing while the lumen, the central channel, remains relatively less narrowed than one might expect. This is one reason people can have significant atherosclerosis without symptoms. The vessel is not yet restricting flow enough under everyday conditions to create angina or obvious exertional warning signs. Meanwhile, the plaque itself may still be biologically active and vulnerable. That vulnerability matters because not all plaques are equally dangerous. A plaque that causes a fairly stable narrowing may produce predictable symptoms during exertion and be recognized as a problem. Another plaque, perhaps not even the largest one, may have a large lipid core, a thin fibrous cap, and more inflammation, making it more prone to rupture or erosion. If that surface breaks, the blood is suddenly exposed to materials it interprets as injury. Platelets gather. A clot forms. Flow can be reduced dramatically or cut off. The event then appears sudden, even though the plaque had been preparing for its moment with infuriating patience for years. Again, the silence beforehand is part of what makes the outcome feel so shocking. People often ask why the arteries do not hurt while plaque is building. The answer is partly anatomical and partly functional. Pain is not a direct measure of seriousness. It depends on which tissues are involved, how they are innervated, whether a process stretches, compresses, inflames, or deprives an area in a way that triggers sensory pathways, and how the brain interprets those signals. The inside of an artery wall is not a stage built for early dramatic symptom production. A plaque quietly accumulating within the vessel wall does not necessarily create a signal the nervous system translates into useful warning. By contrast, when blood flow to the heart muscle becomes insufficient, especially during exertion, the muscle itself may generate discomfort. That is often later in the process, and if a clot suddenly forms, then the crisis is the first unmistakable sign. This is why silence should never be mistaken for safety. In cardiovascular disease, silence often means only that the threshold for noticeable dysfunction has not yet been crossed, or that the biological trouble is taking place in a form that does not generate clear symptoms. Many people live for years in that territory. Their coronary arteries may already contain plaque, their vessel walls may already be inflamed, their endothelial function may already be impaired. But because they can still climb stairs, carry shopping, complain about their internet speed, and eat a sandwich without collapsing, they conclude that the system must be fine. Function can remain surprisingly normal while risk accumulates. That apparent normality is helped by the remarkable reserve capacity of the cardiovascular system. The heart and blood vessels are built to handle variation. At rest, the heart does not usually require every possible ounce of blood flow the coronary circulation can provide. During activity, the vessels can dilate. collateral circulation may develop in some people, creating alternate pathways of blood supply. The whole system is adaptable. This is excellent news for survival. It is less excellent for early detection by casual observation. A person can compensate beautifully while disease progresses quietly beneath the surface. The body keeps going. Meetings are attended, laundry is done, holidays are booked. At no point does the calendar send a note saying, "Please be advised that your left anterior descending artery has entered an unhelpful phase." The word atherosclerosis is worth spending time on because it's often treated as though it were merely a storage problem, some greasy accumulation of dietary bad decisions along the vessel wall. That version is both oversimplified and misleading. Atherosclerosis is not just passive deposition. It is a chronic inflammatory disease of the arterial wall involving lipoproteins, immune activity, endothelial dysfunction, smooth muscle cells, connective tissue, and repeated cycles of injury and repair. The plaque that forms is not inert sludge. It is a living lesion, metabolically and immunologically active. Some plaques calcify over time and become more stable. Others remain soft, inflamed, and vulnerable. The silence of the process can make it seem less serious than it is, but the biology is anything but idle. One of the reasons this process is so difficult for people to picture is that it does not map well onto everyday sensation. If a joint becomes inflamed, you may feel pain when moving. If skin is injured, you see redness or swelling. If the stomach is upset, it usually provides fairly direct commentary. Arteries are less conversational. Their dysfunction is often inferred through consequences, risk factors, and imaging rather than directly felt. This makes prevention harder because human beings are strongly motivated by immediate feedback. We floss more enthusiastically after a dentist frowns. We drive more carefully after a near miss. But when the consequences of harmful physiology are delayed by years and mostly silent in the meantime, it is much easier to believe that nothing important is happening. Silence also helps explain why some first presentations of coronary disease are so serious. If plaque has been building quietly without limiting flow enough to cause symptoms, then the first notable event may not be mild discomfort during exercise. It may be a heart attack. It may be unstable angina. It may be an abnormal stress test performed for some other reason. It may even be sudden cardiac arrest if the first major problem is an electrical catastrophe triggered by acute ischemia. This is not the usual outcome for everyone, but it is one reason clinicians take risk factors seriously even in people who feel well. Feeling well is useful information. It is not the only information. There is another piece to the silence, and it involves time. The body is good at making gradual change feel normal. If stamina drifts down slowly, a person may attribute it to age, work, bad sleep, being busy, or merely the general insult of having errands. If mild exertional chest discomfort appears only occasionally, they may blame indigestion, posture, or the sandwich again. If breathlessness is subtle, they may not notice until something forces comparison. Slow change blends into life. Sudden change gets attention. Yet slow change is often what sets the stage for sudden events. The arteries can become more diseased while a person's interpretation of themselves remains years out of date. This is especially true when the person does not match the stereotype of a cardiac patient. Someone younger, fit, thin, or outwardly health conscious may be even less likely to interpret symptoms as cardiovascular. Their relatives may do the same. Sometimes clinicians do too, at least initially. The silence of the arteries is then joined by the silence created by assumptions. A symptom is not only quiet in the body, it is quiet in interpretation. It gets filed under stress, overexertion, anxiety, hormones, acid reflux, or an unfortunate pillow. Quite a few things in medicine become more dangerous when they are both biologically subtle and culturally misclassified. Imaging has taught medicine a great deal about this hidden world. Coronary artery calcium scans, CT coronary angiography, carotid ultrasound in some settings, and other tools can reveal disease that has produced little or no symptom signal. People are often startled when imaging shows plaque in someone who runs regularly and feels perfectly fine. But the image is simply making visible what the arteries had been keeping to themselves. Calcified plaque, in particular, is evidence of atherosclerotic disease that has been present long enough to leave a measurable mark. Not all plaques calcify early, and not all dangerous plaques are heavily calcified, but the broader lesson remains the same. The vessel wall may contain a long history, long before daily life has noticed anything unusual. Laboratory markers play a similar role. Elevated LDL cholesterol, high apolipoprotein B, elevated lipoprotein A, diabetes and persistent hypertension are not symptoms, but they are clues to an environment in which arterial silence may be hiding meaningful disease. This is why preventive medicine can feel slightly unsatisfying emotionally. It asks people to care about invisible processes supported by numbers and probabilities rather than by immediate pain. It asks them to respond to risk before catastrophe provides motivation. That is a sensible arrangement scientifically, but human psychology is not always built for it. Many people become fully interested in their arteries only after those arteries have behaved with regrettable boldness. There's also a paradox here. The very resilience of the cardiovascular system, the thing that allows life to continue normally for so long, makes silence possible. If a coronary artery develops gradual narrowing, the heart may compensate. If the endothelium functions a bit less well, daily life does not halt. If blood pressure is mildly elevated, there is no dramatic collapse announcing the issue. The system absorbs stress, adapts, and presses on. This is admirable biology. It is also why disease can become established before attention is captured. The body is loyal to continuity, not to early explanatory clarity. Even when symptoms do finally appear, they may remain elusive because the heart does not always express distress in the way people expect. Classic exertional chest pressure is only one pattern. Some people feel heaviness in the chest. Some feel discomfort in the jaw, shoulder, back or upper abdomen. Some feel unexplained fatigue or shortness of breath. Some notice a vague pressure rather than pain. Some feel nauseated or sweaty. Women, older adults, and people with diabetes may especially present in ways that are less textbook in the popular imagination. The underlying issue is still reduced blood flow or acute plaque-related trouble, but the surface experience may not immediately point the mind toward the coronary arteries that have been so silent for so long. It is worth remembering too that silence does not mean inactivity. An artery with developing atherosclerosis is not a calm place in the biological sense. There may be oxidative stress, immune cell recruitment, endothelial dysfunction, smooth muscle cell migration, extracellular matrix changes, lipid accumulation, microcalcification, and ongoing remodeling of the plaque structure. That is a great deal of activity for something producing no obvious symptom. The quiet is only on the level of personal awareness. Inside the wall, there can be a considerable amount of argument, repair, and instability underway. All of this explains why prevention and screening matter even when someone feels well. It is not because medicine delights in making healthy people nervous. It is because the arteries are not especially generous with advance notice. Risk factors, family history, blood work, blood pressure measurements, and appropriate imaging in selected people are ways of listening to structures that otherwise tend to stay silent. They are imperfect tools, but they are far better than waiting for the first unmistakable event. The hope is to identify the pattern before rupture, before clot, before ischemia, before the quiet process turns into an emergency, with bright lights and very little patience for denial. So when people say that a heart attack came without warning, that is sometimes true from the point of view of lived experience. It is often not true from the point of view of arterial biology. The warning existed, but it existed in the wrong language. It existed as cholesterol particles entering the vessel wall, as blood pressure straining the endothelium, as inflammation changing plaque behavior, as risk embedded in genes, metabolism or sleep, as years of silent remodeling that no one could feel directly. The arteries were speaking, but they were speaking in chemistry, structure and probability rather than sensation. And once you begin to understand that, the next question becomes even more uncomfortable. Because if the arteries can stay so quiet for so long, then the event that finally exposes them may look less like a slow, inevitable blockage and more like something frighteningly abrupt, which means we have to look much more closely at how a problem that develops over years can suddenly become the sort of emergency that seems to arrive in a single afternoon. What makes a heart attack so frightening is not only the damage it can do, but the speed with which it seems to announce itself. One moment a person is making tea, answering messages, carrying shopping, tying a running shoe, or having a perfectly ordinary disagreement with a printer, and the next moment the body is in genuine trouble. That suddenness is what people remember. It is what families describe. It is what creates the feeling that the event arrived from nowhere. But most of the time, a heart attack is not created in a moment. The moment is simply when the hidden process becomes impossible to ignore. The actual making of the event is usually much slower, involving years of change inside the coronary arteries before the final interruption of blood flow occurs. Most heart attacks are caused by coronary artery disease, where plaque builds up over time in the arteries supplying the heart. When plaque breaks open, a blood clot can form and block the artery. That distinction between a long process and a short crisis matters because people naturally pay attention to drama, not preparation. We notice the ambulance, the chest pain, the hospital monitors, the urgent conversations, the abrupt rearrangement of an ordinary day. We do not notice the years in which the artery wall was slowly changing, becoming a place where cholesterol-rich particles, inflammatory cells, connective tissue and damage repair cycles were quietly shaping a plaque. Atherosclerosis develops over many years, and coronary plaques progress from early arterial wall changes to more complex lesions with lipid-rich cores and fibrous caps. At first, the process is not especially dramatic. The inner lining of the artery, the endothelium, is exposed day after day to blood pressure, blood chemistry, mechanical forces, and the general consequences of being part of a living human rather than a showroom model. When that lining is repeatedly stressed by factors such as elevated LDL cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, or chronic inflammation, it becomes more vulnerable. This makes it easier for certain lipoprotein particles to enter the arterial wall and remain there. Over time, immune cells are drawn into the area, especially macrophages, and the lesion begins to grow into something much more organised and much less welcome. Coronary artery disease is driven primarily by plaque buildup in the heart's arteries, and long-term inflammation, hypertension, and diabetes can damage arterial walls or impair how those vessels respond when the heart needs more blood. One of the reasons this remains invisible for so long is that the early plaque does not always behave like a plug in a sink. People often imagine the artery gradually closing off in one simple direction, as though the problem were nothing more than a narrowing tunnel. Real plaques are more complicated. The arterial wall can remodel as plaque grows, sometimes expanding outward so that the central channel for blood flow is not dramatically narrowed at first. That means the disease can advance while the person experiences little or no reduction in blood flow during normal daily life. Coronary plaque progression is dynamic, and more advanced lesions can develop thin fibrous caps over lipid-rich necrotic cores, creating a structure associated with later rupture. This is where the story becomes more counterintuitive. The plaque most likely to cause a heart attack is not always the plaque that has produced the tightest narrowing for the longest time. Some plaques are relatively stable. They may narrow the artery enough to cause symptoms like angina when the heart works harder, but they may remain structurally less likely to tear at any given moment. Other plaques may be smaller or less obvious on a simple mental picture, yet biologically more fragile. In those, the fibrous cap can become thin, the inflammatory activity higher, and the underlying core more dangerous if exposed to circulating blood. Plaques that narrow arteries slowly can produce angina, but rupture-prone plaques are often characterized by necrotic cores and thinning fibrous caps, which are considered precursor lesions for plaque rupture. So the sudden event is often not a slow blockage, finally reaching 100% in some neat cinematic way. Much more often, the artery has been living with plaque for years, and then one area of plaque breaks open or erodes. At that point, the body reacts as bodies do when they sense injury. Platelets gather, clotting begins, a thrombus forms on the surface of the disrupted plaque. If that clot grows large enough, it can severely narrow or completely block the artery in a short span of time. That is when blood flow to part of the heart muscle falls sharply, and that is when a person crosses from quiet disease into acute coronary syndrome or heart attack. When plaque breaks open, blood clot formation on the plaque surface can rapidly block blood flow to the heart. Acute coronary syndrome happens when blood flow to the heart muscle is suddenly blocked. It is worth pausing over how unfairly efficient this is. The body's clotting system is essential. Without it, a paper cut would become a much more eventful afternoon than anyone needs. But inside a coronary artery, the same protective machinery can become catastrophic. Once blood encounters the disrupted contents of a plaque, it behaves as though repair is urgently needed. In one sense, that is true. In another sense, it is deeply inconvenient, because the repair may be exactly what deprives the heart muscle of oxygen. This is why the event feels fast even when its preparation was slow. The clot is fast. The plaque was slow. The damage becomes obvious only when those two timelines finally meet. Plaque tears can suddenly trigger a clot that severely narrows or blocks the artery, producing unstable angina or myocardial infarction. If untreated, heart muscle begins to die. That also explains why some people say they had no warning, while others describe weeks or months of odd symptoms they did not recognize at the time. Both experiences can be true within the same underlying disease process. If a plaque has been progressing slowly but not limiting blood flow enough to create exertional symptoms, then the first unmistakable sign may be the acute event itself. In other people, there may have been angina beforehand, especially if the artery had become narrowed enough over time to reduce blood flow during stress or exertion. Coronary artery disease that narrows arteries slowly over time can cause angina, while a sudden plaque disruption with clot formation can produce an acute coronary syndrome. Another reason the final event seems so abrupt is that the body is remarkably good at compensating right up until it cannot. The coronary circulation has reserve. The heart does not use every possible drop of its blood supply at rest. Vessels can dilate. The system can tolerate a surprising amount of gradual change before daily life feels different enough to trigger concern. This is useful from a survival point of view. It allows people to function while disease is evolving. It is less useful from a detection point of view, because compensation creates the illusion of safety. Coronary arteries normally widen when the heart needs more oxygen-rich blood during physical activity or stress. But in coronary heart disease, those vessels may fail to widen properly, or may even narrow. There is also the matter of interpretation. When changes happen slowly, people adjust to them. A person who becomes a little more breathless over 6 months may call it stress, age, poor sleep, or simply having been too busy to get back into shape properly. Mild chest pressure after climbing stairs may be blamed on reflux, posture, or a lunch that seemed like a good idea at the time. Fatigue is one of the least respected symptoms in human history. It is dismissed with almost heroic determination. Because the event itself is abrupt, the earlier drift in symptoms is often only recognized in hindsight. Acute coronary syndromes can present with chest discomfort, pain spreading to the arm, jaw, back or stomach, shortness of breath, dizziness, nausea, and sweating. But those symptoms are not always interpreted correctly at first. The slow preparation also helps explain why a heart attack can happen in someone who seemed to be doing many things right. If the plaque started forming years earlier, perhaps influenced by genetics, LDL burden, blood pressure, inflammation, diabetes, or smoking history, then current outward health may not fully reflect the biological history already stored in the artery wall. A person can be fitter now than they were 10 years ago, and still be living with plaque that formed during a different period of life. Another can have a strong exercise routine and still carry inherited risk that ordinary discipline cannot simply erase. Risk factors begin affecting coronary health early, and prevention is most effective when started long before symptoms appear. This is one of the most difficult things for people to absorb emotionally. We like to imagine the body responding to recent behaviour in a tidy and morally legible way. We had a salad, therefore the arteries applaud. We took up jogging, therefore the plaque packs its things and leaves. We switched to olive oil, therefore the cardiovascular system sends a note of appreciation. Real life is less theatrical. Beneficial changes absolutely matter, often a great deal, but the body is cumulative. Arteries reflect exposures and conditions over years. Improvement helps, stabilization helps, lowering LDL helps, better blood pressure helps, better glucose control helps, quitting smoking helps enormously. None of these are wasted. But they do not rewrite history overnight. Coronary heart disease is largely preventable, and heart-healthy living can prevent or delay disease and its complications in most people, but plaque buildup itself develops over long periods. There is a related mistake people make when they picture a heart attack as the end point of one single mechanism. In reality, there are several ways the final crisis can happen, even if plaque rupture with thrombosis is the classic pathway. Some plaques erode rather than rupture. Some arteries go into spasm. Some people have disease in the smaller coronary vessels rather than obvious blockages in the large surface arteries. A smaller group have myocardial infarction without obstructive coronary artery disease, sometimes due to coronary embolism, spontaneous coronary artery dissection, or vasospasm. These are not the most common explanations, but they matter because they remind us that sudden event is a surface description, not a complete mechanism. Not all heart attacks are caused by atherosclerotic blockage. Menocca can occur from causes such as coronary embolism or spontaneous coronary artery dissection, and coronary vasospasm can also cut off blood flow. Still, in the majority of cases, the slow-making pattern remains central. Plaque develops. Inflammation shapes it. The cap over the plaque becomes more or less stable. Mechanical stress and biological activity continue day after day. Then, at some particular moment, whether during exercise, rest, emotional stress, sleep, or some utterly unromantic household task, the lesion becomes unstable enough for the surface to fail. A clot forms, blood flow drops, symptoms begin. The emergency is acute, but the artery has been heading toward it for a long time. The progression of coronary atherosclerosis from early intimal changes to fibroatheroma and thin cap fibroatheroma is understood as a gradual process, while acute coronary syndrome occurs when blood flow is suddenly blocked. This is why the phrase came out of nowhere is both understandable and misleading. It came out of nowhere in lived experience because the person was not consciously aware of the disease evolving. It did not come out of nowhere biologically. The mechanisms were present. The risk factors were doing their work. The vessel wall was changing. The plaque was maturing. The final trigger may have been hard to predict, but the underlying terrain was not empty. Heart attacks usually arise from atherosclerotic coronary disease that develops over years before a plaque disruption, and clot suddenly cut off blood flow. Perhaps the most important practical lesson here is that prevention has to care about the slow part, not just fear the sudden part. By the time the event is obvious, medicine is trying to rescue heart muscle and limit damage. That is vital work, but it is late work. The earlier work happens long before that. Recognizing blood pressure that is creeping upward, taking high LDL seriously, asking about family history, not dismissing diabetes or pre-diabetes, investigating symptoms that do not fit the popular movie version of heart trouble, and understanding that feeling functional is not the same thing as having stable coronary arteries. Prevention efforts are aimed at keeping the blood vessels healthy early in life because coronary risk factors begin developing in childhood and can lead to later disease and complications. This way of thinking also changes how one hears stories about apparently healthy people having heart attacks. Rather than hearing a contradiction, it is often more accurate to hear a delayed reveal. The person may indeed have been healthy in many visible ways. They may have had admirable habits and good functional health. What they were not necessarily was free of the slow biology of atherosclerosis or other coronary problems. Once you see the process this way, the event stops looking like a lightning strike from a clear sky and starts looking more like the abrupt final failure of a structure that had been under quiet strain for longer than anyone knew. Plaque buildup, vascular dysfunction, and in some cases coronary spasm or other non-obstructive causes can all contribute to heart attack risk even before symptoms are obvious. There is, unfortunately, one more detail that makes this slow to sudden transition especially cruel. The plaques most likely to trigger an acute event are not always the ones that looked most dramatic from the outside or caused the longest history of symptoms. The dangerous change may involve a fragile cap, an inflamed lesion, and a clot that forms quickly once the surface is disrupted. So the ordinary person living with coronary disease may not be carrying around a ticking bomb, in the cartoon sense of one giant blockage that everyone missed. They may be carrying several plaques of differing ages and personalities, one of which eventually behaves badly enough to summon the clotting system into action at exactly the wrong place and exactly the wrong time. Thin cap fibroatheroma is considered a precursor to plaque rupture, and plaque rupture with thrombosis is a major pathway leading to acute myocardial infarction. All of this brings us to a sobering but useful conclusion. A heart attack may be sudden in experience, but it is usually slow in construction. The speed belongs to the final blockage. The years belong to the artery wall. Once those timelines are separated, the event becomes less mysterious and more medically intelligible. That matters because the next step is not merely to know that plaque builds up over time, but to understand what makes one quiet plaque remain quiet, while another develops the sort of unstable surface that can crack, attract platelets, and turn a long silent process into an emergency in the span of minutes. If plaque is the structure people tend to imagine when they think about a future heart attack, inflammation is the part they usually do not picture at all. It is less visible, less intuitive, and much harder to turn into a neat mental image. Cholesterol at least sounds concrete. Blood pressure sounds measurable. A blocked artery sounds like plumbing. Inflammation sounds vague, almost like one of those words that gets blamed for everything from sore knees to a disappointing week. Yet in cardiovascular disease, inflammation is not a decorative side issue. It is one of the central biological processes that helps explain why a slow build-up in the artery wall sometimes becomes an unstable, dangerous lesion rather than a quiet and uneventful one. Researchers now describe atherosclerosis not simply as fat collecting in the wrong place, but as a chronic inflammatory disease of the artery wall, beginning with injury or dysfunction in the vessel lining and continuing through plaque growth and complications. It helps to start by rescuing the word inflammation from its bad reputation. Inflammation is not inherently harmful. It is one of the body's basic defense and repair programs. If you cut your finger, fight off an infection, or damage a tissue, inflammation helps coordinate the response. Cells communicate, immune pathways activate, and the body attempts to contain the problem and begin repair. That is useful, necessary, and often life-saving. The trouble begins when inflammation becomes chronic, poorly resolved, or active in the wrong place. Inside an artery wall, a persistent inflammatory response can turn what might have remained a manageable accumulation of lipid into a much more unstable and biologically active plaque. That is why modern cardiology pays so much attention not only to cholesterol levels, but also to the immune and inflammatory environment in which those lipids are acting. NHLBI notes that inflammation interacts with lipids from the very beginning of atherosclerosis through its progression and complications, and review literature describes atherosclerosis as a maladaptive, non-resolving inflammatory disease. So how does this begin in ordinary terms? The inner lining of the artery, the endothelium, is meant to help keep blood moving smoothly and the vessel functioning normally. But when that lining is stressed by factors such as high DL cholesterol, high blood pressure, smoking, diabetes or other injury, the environment changes. The arterial wall becomes more permeable, more reactive, and more likely to attract inflammatory cells. NHLBI describes plaque buildup as beginning with damage to the arteries. Inflammatory cells then travel to those damaged areas, release chemical signals, and help create the conditions in which cholesterol and cell waste collect. White blood cells gather, ingest cholesterol, and contribute to plaque formation. In other words, cholesterol does not act alone. It becomes dangerous in part because the vessel wall and the immune system start interacting with it in ways that amplify the problem. This is one of the reasons the phrase blocked by cholesterol is too simple to tell the real story. If the artery wall were just a shelf and cholesterol were just dust, then perhaps the solution would be merely less dust. But the wall is living tissue, and the particles entering it are noticed. Macrophages and other immune cells move in. They ingest lipids and become foam cells. Cytokines and chemical signals circulate locally. Smooth muscle cells respond. Collagen is produced, rearranged, and sometimes degraded. A fibrous cap forms over a lipid-rich core. The lesion grows not as an inert deposit, but as an active, ongoing argument between injury, repair, lipid retention, and immune activation. That is why two plaques of similar size may not carry the same danger. One may be more stable, with a thicker cap and a calmer inflammatory profile. Another may be more fragile, with more inflammatory activity and a thinner cap that is easier to disrupt. Review literature on plaque vulnerability emphasizes that inflammation affects mechanical stability by weakening the collagen-rich cap, while NHLBI notes that inflammation can help trigger plaque rupture and severe blood clots. This is where inflammation earns its title as an invisible spark. It is not always the biggest visible feature, but it can be the thing that changes the whole character of the plaque. A plaque that simply sits there narrowing an artery slowly is one problem. A plaque made fragile by inflammation is a different problem entirely. The danger is not only how much room it occupies, the danger is what kind of lesion it has become. Inflammation can increase the activity of enzymes that degrade collagen and reduce the tensile strength of the fibrous cap. If that cap becomes thin enough, mechanical stress and ongoing immune activity make rupture or erosion more likely. Once the plaque surface is disrupted, the blood suddenly encounters material that strongly promotes clot formation. The quiet lesion becomes an acute emergency. This is why cardiologists care so much about plaque vulnerability, not just plaque size. What makes all of this so difficult for ordinary life is that inflammation usually does not feel like anything specific while it is shaping cardiovascular risk. A person does not wake up and say, with admirable clarity, that their coronary arteries seem immunologically unsettled today. Chronic low-grade inflammation is often silent. It may coexist with feeling fine, functioning well, and looking entirely healthy. That is partly why heart attacks in outwardly healthy people are so disturbing. They reveal that a quiet inflammatory process may have been helping prepare the ground for years. The American Heart Association's recent professional guidance on HSCRP, a marker of inflammation, specifically notes that elevated HSCRP is linked to future heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular death, even in healthy individuals with normal cholesterol. That does not mean HSCRP is itself the villain doing all the damage, but it does mean that measurable low-grade inflammation can identify people whose arteries may be carrying more hidden risk than appearances suggest. That point about HSCRP is important because it marks a shift in how doctors think about cardiovascular risk. For years, the conversation was dominated by lipids, blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, and age. Those remain crucial and are not going anywhere. But inflammation has increasingly been recognised as part of the residual risk that remains, even when some traditional numbers look acceptable. High sensitivity C-reactive protein is not a direct snapshot of one coronary plaque, and it can rise for reasons unrelated to artery disease, so it has to be interpreted carefully. Still, it gives clinicians another way of noticing hidden danger, particularly in people who do not look like the classic cardiac patient. The American Heart Association's professional education materials describe HSCRP as a measure of silent arterial inflammation that can help identify at-risk patients, including people with normal cholesterol. Inflammation also helps explain why certain chronic conditions raise cardiovascular risk, even when they do not begin in the heart. Diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis are not merely inconveniences of joints or skin. They reflect systemic inflammatory activity, and that activity can injure blood vessels and promote plaque development. NHLB specifically lists inflammatory diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis among conditions that can injure blood vessels and contribute to atherosclerosis. This is a useful reminder that the cardiovascular system does not live in polite isolation from the rest of the body. A person may think of themselves as having an inflammatory condition over there, in the skin or joints, while their arteries are quietly participating in the consequences. The same logic extends in different ways to diabetes, obesity, and long-term metabolic dysfunction, all of which can create a pro-inflammatory environment that is much more biologically active than the calm surface of daily life suggests. Smoking belongs in this conversation for the same reason. People often frame smoking mainly as a chemical insult that raises heart attack risk, which it is, but part of its damage comes through inflammation and injury to the vessel wall. NHLBI notes that smoking and even secondhand smoke are linked to atherosclerosis-related disease, while the underlying mechanism includes endothelial injury and inflammatory signalling that make the artery more receptive to plaque formation. High blood pressure does something similar by placing mechanical stress on the arterial wall. Diabetes contributes through glycemic injury, metabolic dysfunction, and inflammatory pathways. None of these factors operate in neat isolation. They interact. Inflammation is often the common language through which many different forms of vascular stress become one accumulating cardiovascular problem. There is another subtle reason inflammation matters. It helps explain why the risk associated with a plaque is not fixed forever. A plaque is not born with a permanent destiny. Its stability can change. Its inflammatory activity can rise or fall. Its cap can thicken or weaken. Calcification patterns can evolve. The biological weather around it can improve or worsen depending on lipid levels, smoking status, metabolic control, systemic inflammation, medications, and time. That is one reason treatment matters so much even after plaque has already formed. Lowering LDL is essential, but part of the benefit of statins appears to involve anti-inflammatory effects as well. NHLBI notes that statins often reduce both LDL cholesterol and inflammation, helping curb cardiovascular risk in some patients. This dual effect is one reason they remain central to prevention and treatment. They are not simply cholesterol detergents, they help alter the biology of the plaque itself. The modern evidence for inflammation as a genuine treatment target became much harder to ignore after outcome trials tested anti-inflammatory drugs directly. The CANTOS trial studied canakinumab, which targets the interleukin-1 beta pathway, in more than 10,000 patients with prior myocardial infarction and elevated HSCRP. It lowered HSCRP without lowering lipids, and, at the 150 mg dose, significantly reduced recurrent cardiovascular events compared with placebo. That mattered, because it showed that reducing inflammation could reduce risk independently of lipid lowering. It was not a perfect solution, since it also increased fatal infection risk and is not the sort of drug casually handed out with breakfast cereal, but it provided strong evidence that inflammation is not merely a bystander. It participates directly enough in cardiovascular disease that treating it can change outcomes. Colchicine added further support to the same idea. In the LODECO-2 trial, patients with chronic coronary disease who received low-dose colchicine had significantly fewer cardiovascular events than those who received placebo. The reduction covered outcomes such as spontaneous myocardial infarction, ischemic stroke, cardiovascular death, and ischemia-driven revascularization. This does not mean every person worried about heart disease should now become emotionally attached to colchicine. Treatment decisions remain individualized, and drugs that influence inflammation are not free of side effects or trade-offs. But the broader lesson is important. If calming inflammation lowers events in coronary disease, then inflammation is not just smoke drifting over the fire, it is part of the fire itself. At the same time, inflammation should not be treated as an all-purpose villain floating mysteriously through the bloodstream waiting to ruin an otherwise decent day. It works together with lipids. This point comes up repeatedly in current cardiovascular research. Peter Libby, quoted by NHLBI, describes inflammation as acting synergistically with lipids to worsen cardiovascular risk. That word synergistically matters. It means cholesterol and inflammation are often partners in the problem. One helps create the substrate, the other helps shape the lesion's behavior and vulnerability. If you only lower inflammation while ignoring a very high LDL burden, you have not solved the full problem. If you only stare at cholesterol and ignore the inflammatory side of a vulnerable plaque, you may also miss part of the danger. The real world is mixed. The artery wall has many contributors, and the worst outcomes often emerge when several of them line up together. This mixed reality also helps explain why a person can seem healthy and still carry inflammatory cardiovascular risk. Someone may have normal body weight, decent stamina, and a careful diet, but also poor sleep, chronic psychological stress, an autoimmune condition, periodontal disease, metabolic strain, or a genetically influenced inflammatory profile. Another may have normal LDL, but elevated hsCRP. Another may have treated cholesterol but persistent inflammatory activity. None of this means that ordinary healthy habits are unimportant. On the contrary, lifestyle matters because it can influence both traditional risk factors and low-grade inflammation. The American Heart Association's professional materials now explicitly discuss lifestyle interventions as ways to reduce low-grade systemic inflammation, while NHLBI emphasizes that lowering both inflammation and LDL is often beneficial. Sleep, in particular, deserves more respect than it usually gets in public discussion of heart disease. It is often handled as a personality trait, somewhere between virtue and inconvenience. But poor sleep contributes to blood pressure elevation, metabolic disruption, and inflammatory signaling. The same is true of chronic stress, especially when it becomes a way of life rather than a temporary problem. No single stressful week creates a plaque worthy of its own documentary, but sustained physiological strain can shift the immune, hormonal, and vascular environment in ways that make inflammation easier to sustain. These influences are difficult to dramatize because they are gradual and familiar. They do not look like obvious danger. They look like modern life. The arteries may describe them differently. Current NHLBI discussion of cardiovascular inflammation includes psychosocial stress among the influences being studied for how they may worsen atherosclerosis through immune cell pathways. There is, however, a trap here, and it is worth avoiding. Once people hear that inflammation is involved in heart attacks, they are tempted to start using the word as a vague universal explanation for all discomfort and all disease. That is not helpful. Inflammation is real, measurable, and important, but it is not a replacement for actual risk assessment. One does not learn much by vaguely announcing that inflammation is bad. The useful questions are more concrete. Is LDL elevated? Is blood pressure controlled? Is diabetes present? Is there smoking exposure? Is there an inflammatory disease? Is hsCRP elevated in a meaningful clinical context? Is there existing coronary disease? What medications and lifestyle changes are appropriate for this actual person? Those questions move the idea of inflammation out of wellness folklore and back into medicine, where it belongs. The AHA's hsCRP materials emphasize that awareness of elevated hsCRP can help identify at-risk patients and tailor care, not substitute for the rest of cardiovascular assessment. What makes inflammation such a useful concept in this story is that it explains the difference between a plaque that merely exists and a plaque that becomes dangerous. It helps connect the quiet build-up of years with the suddenness of an acute event. It explains why chronic disease elsewhere in the body can matter to the heart, why some people with ordinary-looking cholesterol still carry risk, why statins do more than adjust numbers, and why anti-inflammatory therapies can reduce events in selected patients. Most of all, it explains why heart attacks are not simply about how full an artery becomes, but about how active, irritated, and unstable the lesion inside the artery has been allowed to become over time. Inflammation helps turn a long silent process into a fragile situation waiting for the wrong mechanical stress at the wrong spot. And once you see that, the next piece falls into place almost uncomfortably fast, because an inflamed, vulnerable plaque is still not the heart attack itself. Something else has to happen. The surface has to fail, the blood has to respond, and a clot has to form with impeccable bad timing, which is where the story moves from years of invisible biological irritation to the very abrupt business of cracks, clots, and a coronary artery that suddenly becomes far more blocked than it was the moment before. By the time a heart attack becomes obvious, two different problems have usually collided. One is structural. The artery has been changed over time by plaque. The other is immediate. A clot has formed in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. That is why the event feels so abrupt. Plaque can take years to develop, but once a plaque breaks open or erodes, the blood responds quickly. Acute coronary syndromes most often result from an acute thrombus forming in an atherosclerotic coronary artery after unstable or inflamed plaque ruptures or splits, and the resulting thrombus can abruptly interfere with blood flow to the heart muscle. This is the part people rarely imagine in advance. They tend to picture a heart attack as a slow narrowing that finally becomes a blockage, as if the artery were closing like a road under construction, with plenty of warning signs and one apologetic detour. Real life is often less courteous. A plaque may be sitting in the artery wall causing only modest narrowing, and still become dangerous because its surface fails. Merck's review of acute coronary syndromes notes that even plaques causing relatively little obstruction before the event can rupture and thrombose, and in more than half of cases the stenosis before the event is less than 40%. In other words, the plaque that causes the emergency is not always the one that looked most dramatic beforehand. That one detail changes the whole emotional logic of heart disease. It explains why someone can have little or no prior chest pain, pass through ordinary life without obvious warning, and then suddenly develop a medical emergency. It also explains why the final event seems so unfairly timed. The artery did not necessarily have to be nearly closed all week. It only had to contain a plaque unstable enough to crack, rupture, or erode on that particular day. When that happens, the blood sees exposed material it interprets as injury, and it reacts as blood has been trained to react since long before anyone had a cardiologist. Platelets activate, the clotting cascade begins, and a thrombus forms on top of the plaque. A clot, in other words, is not some exotic extra problem layered on top of coronary disease. It is very often the thing that transforms long-standing disease into an acute event. Without the clot, a person may have stable coronary disease, perhaps even no symptoms at all. With the clot, the situation can change in minutes. The American Heart Association notes that acute coronary syndrome happens when blood flow to the heart muscle is suddenly blocked, and that if a blood clot forms due to plaque rupture, a part of the clot may block a coronary artery and cause ACS. The key word there is suddenly. The years belong to the plaque. The suddenness belongs to the thrombus. It is worth slowing down over what the clot is actually doing. Blood normally flows through the coronary arteries and delivers oxygen to the heart muscle. If a thrombus forms and only partly narrows the artery, it may still reduce blood flow enough to produce unstable angina or a non-ST elevation myocardial infarction. If it more completely obstructs the vessel, a larger area of heart muscle can lose blood supply, leading to a more severe infarction. Merck notes that the thrombus may obstruct only transiently or partially in some patients, while in others it lasts long enough to cause tissue necrosis. This is why some events are frightening and painful, but leave limited damage, while others become full emergencies with rapidly dying heart muscle. And yet even this still makes the process sound slightly too neat, because plaque disruption itself comes in more than one form. Plaque rupture is the classic mechanism and remains the most common cause of acute myocardial infarction, especially in men, but plaque erosion is also a major culprit. In plaque rupture, the fibrous cap over a lipid-rich core breaks, exposing highly thrombogenic material. In plaque erosion, the surface layer is damaged or denuded without the same classic cap rupture, but the result can still be thrombosis. Pathology reviews describe plaque rupture and plaque erosion as the coronary plaque morphologies primarily responsible for thrombosis in acute myocardial infarction. That matters because it reminds us that the artery is not a simple pipe with one simple failure mode. There are several ways a lesion can become dangerous, and the blood is not fussy about the distinction once thrombogenic material is exposed. It simply gets to work. Platelets change shape, adhere to the damaged surface, recruit more platelets, and help build a growing plug. The coagulation system lays down fibrin, stabilizing the clot. Merck specifically notes that plaque disruption exposes thrombogenic material, activates platelets and the coagulation cascade, and produces an acute thrombus. A process that began as microscopic endothelial trouble and slow plaque development now becomes a rapidly evolving obstruction in a vessel that was supposed to be feeding the most hard-working muscle in the body. This is also why timing feels so malicious in stories of heart attacks. The person often was not doing anything especially dramatic. Sometimes they were exercising, yes, and sometimes strenuous activity can act as a short-term trigger, especially in people who are otherwise unaccustomed to intense exertion. Sometimes the trigger is anger or emotional upset. Sometimes the event occurs during sleep or in the morning hours. Sometimes it happens while doing something so ordinary that relatives mention it later with lingering disbelief, as though the sheer banality of making toast ought to have offered legal protection. Research from Interheart found that physical exertion and anger or emotional upset were associated with first myocardial infarction across regions, ages and sexes, while observational studies have repeatedly found a morning peak in heart attack onset, often between 6 a.m. and noon. The important thing, though, is not to misunderstand triggers as causes in the full sense. A burst of anger does not usually create a dangerous coronary plaque from nothing. Heavy exertion does not invent years of atherosclerosis in one afternoon. Triggers are better thought of as the final nudge on an already vulnerable system. They may increase blood pressure, sympathetic tone, vasoconstriction, platelet activity, or mechanical stress on a plaque that was already susceptible. The vulnerable ground has to exist first. A trigger by itself means far less in an artery that is stable than it does in one containing an inflamed fragile lesion with the biological temperament of a badly repaired ceiling. Morning timing is a particularly curious example of this. Researchers have long described a circadian variation in acute myocardial infarction, with a morning peak in symptom onset. That pattern is thought to relate in part to morning changes in sympathetic activity, blood pressure, and vascular reactivity. One prospective observational study reported that nearly a third of heart attack presentations clustered between 6 a.m. and noon. That does not mean breakfast is trying to kill anyone. It means the body has rhythms, and some of those rhythms can make a vulnerable plaque more likely to misbehave at certain times. Biology likes schedules far more than people do, and unfortunately one of its recurring appointments appears to involve making coronary events more common in the morning. There is another reason the worst timing imaginable keeps showing up in these stories. A clot does not need to become massive over hours to be dangerous. A relatively small plaque disruption can produce a quickly forming thrombus in a crucial location. The coronary arteries are not huge, and the territory supplied by a given segment matters enormously. If the clot forms in a vessel serving a large portion of myocardium, or in a proximal segment where much of the downstream muscle depends on it, the consequences can be immediate and severe. AHA and NHLBI both emphasize that once blood flow is suddenly blocked, the heart muscle begins to suffer, and if the blockage is not treated quickly, part of the heart muscle begins to die. This is why immediate treatment matters so much. When clinicians say time is muscle, they are not trying to be dramatic for sport. They mean that the longer the artery remains obstructed, the more myocardial tissue is injured or lost. Some spontaneous thrombolysis can occur, and Merck notes that spontaneous clot breakdown happens in a portion of patients, but it is obviously not something one should sit around hoping for while trying to decide whether the chest pressure is perhaps an unusually philosophical form of indigestion. The heart tolerates ischemia poorly, and the margin between salvageable tissue and permanent damage can narrow quickly. The clot itself may also behave unpredictably. It can stay where it formed and enlarge. Part of it can break away. The American Heart Association notes that if a blood clot forms because of plaque rupture, part of the clot may break away and block a coronary artery. The result, from the patient's point of view, is the same broad category of emergency: sudden loss of blood supply to heart muscle. What changes is the exact anatomy, the severity, and the pattern seen on the electrocardiogram and in later imaging. What does not change is the general principle that the event has crossed from chronic disease into an acute thrombosis problem, and that is a very different kind of day for the body. There is also a quieter cruelty in the fact that people may have more than one vulnerable plaque at once. Coronary disease is often diffuse. The artery that finally causes the event may not be the only diseased site. Older research in the New England Journal found that patients presenting with acute myocardial infarction often harboured multiple complex coronary plaques, not just one isolated dramatic lesion. That helps explain why a single heart attack is not always the end of the story unless the whole risk environment is addressed. The visible crisis may come from one culprit lesion, but the vascular background often includes a broader field of disease. The clot chose one stage, but the theatre was already built. All of this also helps explain a frustrating medical truth. Severity of prior symptoms and severity of eventual event do not always match neatly. Someone may have had stable angina for a while because of fixed, narrowing, limited blood flow during exertion, and yet that lesion may remain relatively stable. Someone else may have had almost no warning because a less obstructive but more vulnerable plaque suddenly ruptured and thrombosed. Merck's review makes this explicit by noting that pre-event stenosis is often not severe even when the eventual event is major. So the worst timing imaginable is not only about the clock or the trigger, it is about the mismatch between what the artery looked like in ordinary life and what it was actually capable of doing once the surface failed. It is tempting to treat this as pure bad luck, but that would blur something important. Chance does play a role in the exact moment an event occurs, just as chance influences when a crack in a weakened wall finally gives way. But the conditions for that crack are not random. They were prepared by lipids, inflammation, blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, endothelial dysfunction, and time. The final clot is dramatic, but it is not independent. It is the blood's response to a lesion that had already become dangerous. Calling the whole thing random is a bit like calling a house fire random because you only noticed it when the kitchen alarm finally started screaming. The surprise is real. The preparation was real too. There is one more complication worth keeping in view: Not all acute coronary events come from classic plaque rupture in obstructive coronary disease. N, H, LBI and Merck both note other causes, including coronary vasospasm, coronary embolism, spontaneous coronary artery dissection, and myocardial infarction in the absence of obstructive coronary artery disease, sometimes called MNOCA. These are less common than atherosclerotic plaque with thrombosis, but they matter because they remind us that sudden loss of coronary blood flow can happen through more than one mechanism. The emergency room does not particularly care whether the obstruction came from a ruptured plaque or a dissection, while it is trying to preserve your myocardium. Still, for the majority of heart attacks, the main script remains the same. A plaque grows quietly, inflammation weakens or destabilizes it, the surface cracks, ruptures or erodes, platelets rush in, coagulation follows, blood flow falls, symptoms begin. The clot is the fast part, the plaque is the slow part, and the timing is terrible because the body gives its strongest warning only once the vessel is already in trouble. Acute coronary syndrome is the name medicine gives to that collision between long preparation and sudden obstruction. From the outside, it looks like one bad hour. From the inside, it looks like biology finally losing patience. That is also why seemingly healthy people can be caught so off guard. If they have not had symptoms, or have had only vague ones, they may not know that a plaque exists at all. They may be active, productive, outwardly well, and entirely unaware that one unstable lesion has been waiting for a final nudge. Then the clot forms, and the event feels instantaneous. It was not instantaneous. It was merely hidden until the blood itself turned the hidden problem into an urgent blockage. Once you understand that, the next question becomes less about the clot, and more about why one person was carrying vulnerable disease without knowing it, which means we have to shift from the mechanics of rupture and thrombosis to the deeper reasons risk can be quietly built into the body long before any crisis gives it away. One of the more uncomfortable truths about the heart is that some of its risks arrive long before choice enters the room. You do not choose your parents, your grandparents, the version of cholesterol metabolism handed to you at conception, or the quieter little tendencies in your blood vessels that may make plaque form earlier, inflammation run hotter, or clotting behave with too much enthusiasm. People like to talk about health as though it were mostly a matter of character plus groceries. That is understandable. Character and groceries do matter. But there is also inheritance, which is less glamorous, less visible, and often far more influential than anyone would prefer. This is where the idea of being the healthy one can become especially misleading. A person may be active, careful, and outwardly well, yet still be carrying a biological inheritance that changes the entire baseline from which their cardiovascular life begins. The American Heart Association notes that both heart disease itself and some of the major risk factors for heart disease are strongly linked to family history. In other words, genetics may influence not only whether heart disease appears, but also whether the person is more likely to have high cholesterol, hypertension, or other conditions that quietly feed the process. Family history is often treated a bit too casually in ordinary conversation. People remember it in a vague, folkloric way. Grandad had heart trouble. An uncle was never the same after 50. A mother had cholesterol issues. These facts drift around family life like old furniture, always there, rarely inspected. But in medicine, family history is not background decoration. It is a clue. It suggests that the body may have inherited patterns that deserve attention before symptoms ever arrive. The American Heart Association specifically advises people to learn whether parents, siblings, and grandparents had heart disease or stroke, and at what ages those problems developed, because that information helps clarify personal risk. What makes this particularly awkward is that inherited risk does not always announce itself in a dramatic way. Sometimes it does. There are families in which people have heart attacks young enough to make everyone else in the waiting room stare a little too long. There are families in which cholesterol levels are so high that the explanation is not poor habits, but biology, with very strong opinions. but there are also many families in which the inheritance is subtler. Several small genetic influences, each modest on its own, can accumulate into a higher lifelong tendency toward coronary disease. A person may not look unusual. They may not feel unusual. They may simply reach middle age with arteries that have been living under a slightly more difficult set of instructions than average. It helps to think of genetics less as destiny and more as starting conditions. Some people begin the game with a clearer field, some with a steeper hill, and some with one particularly treacherous patch of ground no one bothered to label properly. That does not mean outcome is fixed. It does mean the same lifestyle can produce different levels of risk in different people. Two people can eat similarly, exercise similarly, and sleep with equal mediocrity, and yet one develops premature coronary disease while the other sails along with irritating ease. Part of that difference can lie in inherited biology. The American Heart Association puts this plainly. You cannot counteract your genes completely, but you can help offset them with healthy behaviours and routine medical care. One of the clearest examples is familial hypercholesterolemia, often shortened to FH. This is not a vague tendency toward a bit of cholesterol. It is an inherited disorder affecting the body's ability to clear LDL cholesterol effectively. NHLBI explains that mutations in genes controlling cholesterol levels can cause familial hypercholesterolemia, making it harder for the body to remove LDL from the blood or break it down in the liver. That means a person can be born into a situation where the bloodstream carries high LDL from an early age, often long before anyone would normally think of heart disease. What makes FH especially relevant to tonight's topic is that it can exist in people who do not fit the ordinary public image of someone at risk. They may be young, they may be lean, they may be active, they may have parents who thought the whole family simply ran high cholesterol in the same way some families run tall or stubborn. But FH is not a personality trait. NHLBI notes that about 1 in 250 people have this inherited condition, and that untreated, it can lead to heart attacks and other atherosclerosis complications at young ages. Another NHLBI page describes FH as affecting about 1 in 300 people. Whether one uses the 1 in 250 or 1 in 300 figure, the point is the same. This is not vanishingly rare, and it is entirely capable of placing serious risk inside someone who otherwise appears healthy. There is something almost offensively quiet about that. The person may feel perfectly normal while carrying LDL levels that have been pressing on the artery wall for years. They may eat responsibly and still receive test results that look as though they have been taking dietary advice from a Victorian ghost. This is one of the reasons heart attacks in healthy-looking people can be so shocking. What looks like a contradiction from the outside may, from the inside, be an inherited lipid problem that has been shaping plaque formation since adolescence or earlier. Genetics do not care whether the person now owns running shoes or has switched to oats with admirable regularity. The exposure has often been lifelong. Then there is lipoprotein A, usually written as LPA, which has become one of the most important hidden inherited risks in modern cardiology. It does not get nearly the same public attention as LDL cholesterol, perhaps because its name sounds like something produced by an exhausted committee, but it matters. NHLBI describes elevated LPA as a cardiovascular disease risk factor linked to heart attack, stroke, and other problems, and notes that about 20 to 30% of people worldwide are estimated to have elevated levels. That is a remarkably large number of people walking around with a risk marker many have never heard of. LPA is particularly interesting because it combines several unhelpful traits at once. NHLBI notes that it seems to have many of the same harmful features as LDL, but with extra properties that may support clotting, and it is also linked to inflammation. That matters because a heart attack is not merely a story of slow plaque growth. It is also, very often, a story of plaque instability and thrombosis. a particle that contributes to plaque formation, inflammation, and clotting, is rather like hiring one troublesome employee and discovering he has somehow filled 3 departments with chaos. And then comes the most frustrating part. LPA is largely inherited and does not fluctuate much in response to modifiable risks such as exercise. LBI says that because elevated LPA is mostly due to genetic risk and does not change much with lifestyle, a one-time screening is usually sufficient for most people. The 2026 ACC/AHA dyslipidemia guideline goes even further and recommends measuring LPA at least once in all adults for cardiovascular risk assessment, and the ACC summary notes that lifestyle changes minimally affect LPA levels, so repeat testing is generally unnecessary. This is one of those moments when medicine has to admit that some risk is not particularly interested in whether you have been eating salmon and going for walks. That does not mean LPA dooms someone to a heart attack. NIH LBI is careful on this point. Even when LPA is elevated, it increases risk. It does not guarantee an event. That distinction is crucial. Genetics are powerful, but they are not prophecy. A person with inherited risk may never have a heart attack. Another may have one earlier than expected. The value of knowing about LPA is not to create panic, it is to remove ignorance. Once a clinician knows that this inherited risk is present, the rest of cardiovascular prevention can often be handled more aggressively and more intelligently. There is a broader principle hiding inside all of this. Some genetic influences are rare and strong, like FH. Others are common and distributed across many genes, each contributing a small amount to overall coronary risk. This is where the idea of polygenic risk comes in. Rather than one mutation causing one obvious condition, polygenic risk involves many genetic variants, each with a small effect, adding up into a more favourable or less favourable cardiovascular starting point. A 2024 multi-ethnic cohort study found that higher polygenic risk scores were associated with higher incident coronary heart disease, and that including polygenic risk improved identification of people who might benefit from more intensive risk factor modification. At the same time, the same study noted that polygenic risk scores are not yet considered a formal risk-enhancing factor in guidelines. So the science is useful and increasingly promising, but still not something one should turn into dinner party certainty. That is a useful place to slow down, because genetics has a way of pushing people toward 2 opposite mistakes. The first mistake is fatalism. Heart disease runs in my family, therefore nothing I do matters. The second is denial. I exercise. Therefore family history is just one of those gloomy things relatives bring up at holidays. Both are wrong. The better view is less dramatic and much more useful. Genetics can load the dice. Lifestyle, treatment, screening, and timing still influence how the game unfolds. The American Heart Association specifically says that even when family history is present, healthy living and routine checkups can help lower overall risk. NHLBI likewise says that even with a family history of unhealthy cholesterol, heart-healthy habits starting in childhood and continuing through life can help prevent unhealthy cholesterol and later heart and blood vessel disease. This point matters especially for the kind of person at the centre of tonight's larger theme. Someone who seems healthy, and is healthy in many meaningful ways, but is not as safe as they imagine. Genetics can help explain that gap. A person may have normal body weight, good fitness, reasonable eating habits, and still carry inherited high LDL, elevated LPA, or a broader polygenic burden that raises lifetime coronary risk. Their routine may be admirable. Their arteries may still be receiving a more dangerous biological signal than the outside world can see. That does not make healthy habits pointless. It makes them necessary, but not always sufficient on their own. There is also something important about age here. Genetic risk often shows its hand earlier than people expect. If a person has inherited high LDL, or elevated LPA, the arterial wall may be exposed to harmful conditions for decades before anyone thinks to measure the right things. That is one reason family history and earlier screening matter so much. An apparently healthy 35-year-old with a father who had a heart attack at 48 is not the same as an apparently healthy 35-year-old without that background. The surface can look similar, the biology may not. Atherosclerosis is cumulative. Decades of exposure matter more than one particularly righteous month of salads. Family history can also operate in more indirect ways. Some inherited traits do not cause disease by themselves, but nudge blood pressure, blood sugar regulation, inflammatory tendency, body fat distribution, or lipid patterns in less favourable directions. People often think of genes as causing a disease outright, but quite often they shape a susceptibility that only becomes obvious over time. That makes them harder to notice and easier to dismiss. It is simpler emotionally to believe that whatever happened to one's relatives belonged to their era, their habits, their stress, their cigarettes, their unfortunate devotion to fried things. Sometimes that is partly true. Sometimes it is also a way of avoiding the fact that the body has inherited some of the same tendencies. Even the phrase "runs in the family" can be slippery because families share more than genes. They also share food habits, attitudes toward exercise, stress patterns, sleep habits, access to care, and ways of interpreting symptoms. That means inherited cardiovascular risk is not always purely genetic in the narrow sense. Still, genes remain important enough that medicine keeps returning to them. NHLBI explicitly lists family history as a risk factor for atherosclerosis, and notes that genes may raise risk, especially through inherited cholesterol disorders such as FH. This is not speculation or lifestyle folklore. It is a core part of modern prevention. There is another quiet, practical lesson here. If someone in a family has had premature heart disease, very high cholesterol, or unexplained early vascular problems, that information should not remain trapped in the family as one more dramatic story no one examines. It should travel. Siblings should know. Children, when appropriate, should know. Doctors should know. A person does not need to become theatrical about inherited risk, but they do need to stop treating it like an impolite topic. The earlier certain inherited patterns are identified, the more years there are in which treatment can matter, and treatment does matter. A person with FH may need lipid-lowering therapy much earlier and much more aggressively than someone without it. A person with elevated LPA may need closer attention to LDL, blood pressure, and other modifiable factors because that inherited burden cannot be wished away by improved meal planning. A person with strong family history may merit a more careful risk discussion than their outward health alone would suggest. Genetics, in other words, does not merely explain risk. It changes how prevention should be approached. What it does not do is eliminate hope. That is important enough to say plainly. Inherited cardiovascular risk is real, but it is not the same thing as a scheduled event. The same sources that make the genetic case also make the preventive case. Family history matters, LPA matters, FH matters, polygenic burden matters, and yet healthy behaviour, routine screening, early treatment, and proper follow-up still change outcomes. The body may hand a person a less favourable set of cards, but medicine is not in the business of throwing the deck away just because the opening hand looked unfair. So when a healthy person has a heart attack, genetics is often part of the story people discover afterward and wish they had understood sooner. The body had been carrying a hidden instruction set. The artery wall had been responding to inherited chemistry, inherited lipoproteins, inherited tendencies that did not announce themselves in the mirror. What looked sudden was partly ancestral. What looked unfair was often biological. And once that becomes clear, the next layer of the story is not just what the genes said on paper, but what daily life did with the body those genes built, because some of the strongest risks do not come from inheritance alone, but from the way stress, sleep, and strain keep leaning on that inherited vulnerability year after year. Stress and sleep are often treated as the softer side of health, the slightly vague material that gets mentioned after the important things have already been discussed. Blood pressure sounds serious, cholesterol sounds clinical, coronary arteries sound properly dramatic, stress and sleep sound like the sort of topics people bring up while holding herbal tea and making promises to begin a new routine on Monday. That is unfortunate, because both are deeply involved in cardiovascular health, and not in some mystical or decorative way. They help shape blood pressure, inflammation, metabolic function, behaviour, vascular tone, and recovery. They influence the conditions under which plaque forms, the conditions under which the vessels are strained, and the conditions under which a person may look outwardly functional while carrying a body that is doing more hidden cardiovascular work than it should. LBI notes that stress can tighten arteries and indirectly raise coronary heart disease risk through its effects on behaviour, while the American Heart Association and CDC both describe poor sleep as linked to major cardiovascular risk factors such as high blood pressure, diabetes and obesity. The first difficulty is that stress does not arrive wearing a label that says cardiovascular hazard. It usually arrives disguised as normal life. It looks like deadlines, caregiving, money worries, poor recovery, emotional strain, persistent uncertainty, nighttime rumination, and the sort of tiredness that becomes so ordinary people stop describing it accurately. Many people live under enough pressure that they have stopped thinking of themselves as stressed at all. They think of themselves as busy, coping, managing, pushing through, or simply being an adult in a century with too many passwords. The body, however, does not make quite so much of a linguistic distinction. Sustained psychological strain can activate hormonal and nervous system responses that affect heart rate, blood pressure, vascular constriction, inflammation, and the choices people make when they are depleted. The American Heart Association notes that daily stresses, traumatic incidents, social isolation and loneliness are linked to increased heart disease or stroke risk, and NHLBI notes that stress can constrict arteries and contribute to coronary heart disease risk directly and indirectly. This does not mean that every difficult week is stealthily organising a heart attack. The body is built to handle acute stress. A burst of pressure, fear, effort or emotion is not in itself a moral failing of the cardiovascular system. The problem is chronicity. When stress stops being an occasional demand and becomes the background climate of a person's life, the body can remain in a more activated state than is useful. Blood pressure may run higher, sleep may worsen, recovery may shrink, food choices may become more erratic, exercise may become less consistent, not because the person lacks virtue, but because exhaustion is a rather poor life coach. The American Heart Association notes that chronic stress may lead to high blood pressure and contribute to other cardiovascular risks such as smoking, overeating, and low physical activity. The phrase hidden strain is useful here because stress often becomes harmful long before it becomes dramatic. A person can remain productive, sociable, efficient, and externally competent while internally running a system that is poorly rested, hormonally over-signalled, and metabolically less stable than it ought to be. High functioning is not the same as low strain. In many cases, it simply means the person has learned to perform while tired. That is an admirable social skill, and not always an ideal biological one. This is one of the reasons healthy-seeming people can still carry meaningful cardiovascular risk. They may not drink much, may not smoke, may not be visibly unwell, and may still be living in a state of prolonged physiological wear. The American Heart Association's mental health guidance explicitly links daily stresses and chronic psychological strain with poorer heart health, and NHLBI places stress among the recognised risk factors for coronary heart disease. Sleep belongs in the same conversation, not as a lifestyle accessory, but as one of the body's most fundamental maintenance systems. During adequate sleep, the cardiovascular system gets a period of relative recovery. blood pressure follows normal rhythms, hormonal patterns shift, metabolic processes are regulated, inflammatory signaling is shaped. When sleep is too short, too fragmented, too irregular, or repeatedly interrupted by sleep disorders, that recovery becomes incomplete. The American Heart Association states that poor sleep can cause major cardiovascular disease risk factors, including obesity, high blood pressure, and diabetes, while the CDC notes that adults sleeping fewer than 7 hours are more likely to report health problems, including heart attack, and that some of the linked conditions themselves raise the risk of heart disease, heart attack, and stroke. There is an important difference between being tired and being safely rested that modern life is not especially eager to acknowledge. Many people think of sleep as negotiable, something to shave down in exchange for work, parenting, entertainment, anxiety, or the false belief that one more hour scrolling is somehow restful because the body is horizontal. The body tends to disagree. The CDC says adults should generally get at least 7 hours of sleep per night for optimal health, and the American Heart Association's recent statement on sleep and cardiovascular disease notes that most adults need 7 to 9 hours, and that suboptimal sleep is linked to cardiovascular disease risk, as well as high blood pressure, blood sugar, and cholesterol problems. What makes sleep especially relevant to tonight's topic is that poor sleep can help create the exact kind of hidden cardiovascular vulnerability that does not show up in obvious ways at first. A person may look fit and active, but if they regularly sleep 5 or 6 hours, or sleep in a highly fragmented pattern, or have untreated sleep apnea, the body may be living under repeated strain even while the person appears healthy in daily life. The American Heart Association notes that insufficient or irregular sleep can negatively influence diet, stress, and other lifestyle factors that raise cardiovascular disease risk, and its sleep disorder fact sheet links poor sleep to stress, inflammation, obesity, high blood pressure, and diabetes. Sleep apnea deserves particular respect because it is one of the most quietly effective ways to burden the cardiovascular system while allowing ordinary life to continue just well enough that no one looks too closely. In sleep apnea, breathing repeatedly pauses or becomes restricted during sleep, often causing intermittent drops in oxygen and frequent micro-awakenings. A person may not remember these awakenings. They may simply feel unrested, irritable, foggy, or oddly tired, despite being in bed long enough. Meanwhile, the body experiences repeated stress responses during the night. The American Heart Association's sleep materials include sleep apnea among disorders that may increase cardiovascular disease risk, and its 2025 sleep statement notes that poor sleep continuity, including sleep apnea and repeated awakenings, has been linked to higher risks of heart attack, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, and atrial fibrillation. This is where the phrase body's hidden strain becomes almost literal. Imagine someone who works hard, exercises 3 times a week, looks fine, eats decently, and has no obvious illness. If that same person has untreated sleep apnea, chronic stress, and short sleep for years, the cardiovascular system may be experiencing repeated surges in blood pressure, poor metabolic regulation, disrupted recovery, and more inflammatory signaling than anyone on the outside would suspect. The person still appears healthy because appearance is not a reliable measure of recovery. The American Heart Association and NHLBI both highlight the role of sleep and circadian disruption in hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and inflammation, which are all pathways that can support cardiovascular disease. There is also the issue of timing and regularity, which people tend to underestimate because they assume sleep is only about quantity. Quantity matters, but the body also responds to rhythm. Irregular sleep schedules, circadian disruption, and chronically misaligned sleep-wake patterns appear to affect cardiovascular health through metabolic, inflammatory, and neuroendocrine pathways. NHLB Isla's 2024 workshop summary on sleep and circadian rhythms describes these biological rhythms as crucial to cardiovascular resilience and notes that disruptions exacerbate risk factors such as hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. The American Heart Association's 2026 report on chronotype similarly noted that evening people had poorer overall cardiovascular health and a higher long-term risk of heart attack or stroke than people with more intermediate timing patterns. That does not mean every night owl is headed for calamity. It means the body likes consistency more than modern schedules often provide. When people work rotating shifts, stay up late and rise early, or swing between deprivation on weekdays and compensation on weekends, cardiovascular regulation is asked to operate under erratic conditions. Hormones do not love that. Blood pressure does not love that. Glucose metabolism is not especially fond of it either. The result may not be obvious in the mirror, but the strain accumulates in the same quiet way so much cardiovascular risk does. NHLBI describes sleep and circadian rhythms as governing inflammatory responses, metabolic pathways, and neuroendocrine activity that are important to cardiovascular health. Stress and sleep also cooperate in the least charming manner imaginable. Poor sleep increases stress reactivity. Stress worsens sleep. The tired person becomes more physiologically sensitive to ordinary problems. The stressed person sleeps more lightly, more irregularly, or too briefly. Then the following day begins at a disadvantage, with more caffeine, less patience, and often less capacity to choose the behaviours that would normally help. The American Heart Association notes that insufficient or irregular sleep can negatively influence stress and other lifestyle factors, and its sleep disorder guidance links poor sleep with stress, inflammation, and depression. This feedback loop is one reason hidden strain is so hard to identify from the outside. People may not seem dramatically ill. They may simply seem busy, a bit tired, perhaps slightly tense, perhaps too fond of saying they are fine in the tone of someone actively negotiating with reality. Yet the cardiovascular system is absorbing the cumulative effect of poor recovery. Blood pressure may be higher than it would otherwise be. Blood sugar control may be worse. Appetite and weight regulation may shift. Inflammation may remain more active. The American Heart Association and CDC both connect inadequate sleep to major cardiovascular risk factors, and NHLBI notes that stress can influence both arterial constriction and the behaviours that raise coronary risk. One of the more interesting things about this is how often people misclassify the resulting symptoms. A person with hidden strain may feel fatigue, chest tightness, palpitations, shortness of breath, headaches, or poor exercise tolerance and assume the problem is simply stress, because stress is already the story they use to explain everything else. Sometimes that explanation is partly correct. Sometimes it is dangerously incomplete. The American Heart Association's mental health and post-heart attack materials describe psychological distress as both a contributor to and a consequence of cardiovascular disease, which is another way of saying that the line between just stress and heart-related strain is not always as clean as people hope. This is particularly relevant for people who do not fit the standard picture of cardiac risk. Someone younger, active, or outwardly health conscious may be especially likely to dismiss fatigue, mild breathlessness, chest discomfort, or jaw and back symptoms as mere consequences of overwork and poor sleep. Family members may reinforce that interpretation. Sometimes clinicians initially do as well. Yet if stress and sleep disruption have been amplifying blood pressure, inflammation, and metabolic dysfunction in the background, the body may be moving closer to cardiovascular trouble than anyone realizes. The problem is not that stress is imaginary. The problem is that stress is physiologically real enough to contribute to heart disease while also being socially familiar enough to hide it. NHLBI includes stress among coronary heart disease risk factors, and the American Heart Association links poor sleep with the same broad risk cluster. It is also worth saying that not all stress is purely psychological. The body experiences strain from pain, Chronic illness, caregiving, financial insecurity, discrimination, social isolation, shift work, and fragmented sleep itself. The heart does not particularly distinguish between the forms when it is responding through blood pressure, sympathetic activation, and inflammatory pathways. The American Heart Association explicitly notes that social isolation and loneliness are linked to increased risk of heart attack or stroke, and NHLBI's cardiovascular inflammation research agenda includes psychosocial stress among the factors being studied for how they worsen atherosclerosis. A common mistake, though, is to hear all this and conclude that stress and poor sleep are secret master causes of heart attacks that eclipse everything else. That would be too simple. They're not replacements for cholesterol, blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, genetics, or plaque biology. They are part of the landscape that interacts with those things. Poor sleep can worsen blood pressure and glucose regulation. Chronic stress can promote unhealthy coping behaviors and vascular strain. Together they can make a person more vulnerable, especially if there is already inherited risk or developing atherosclerosis. The American Heart Association's sleep guidance and NHLBI's coronary risk material support exactly that kind of integrative view. These are real risk amplifiers, not magical explanations detached from the rest of cardiovascular medicine. That is also why improving sleep and reducing chronic stress are medically meaningful without being a guarantee of absolute protection. Better sleep can lower blood pressure, improve metabolic control, and reduce some of the hidden wear on the body. Stress reduction can improve behavior, recovery, and possibly cardiovascular physiology. But none of this instantly erases plaque already formed or inherited risks already present. It helps change the environment in which the arteries are living. That matters a great deal. It just does not function like a magical reset button. The American Heart Association's sleep materials frame sleep as a contributor to multiple modifiable risk factors, and CDC guidance emphasizes that healthy sleep is part of heart health, rather than a separate luxury. There is something quietly reassuring about that, even if it is not dramatic. The body may be carrying hidden strain, but strain is not always invisible forever once someone knows where to look. Blood pressure can be measured. Sleep apnea can be evaluated. Patterns of short or irregular sleep can be noticed. Stress can be taken seriously as physiology rather than as a personality flaw. The trouble comes when people continue to admire endurance while ignoring recovery, because endurance can mask risk for quite a long time. A person may keep performing. The arteries may keep recording. Eventually those two stories stop matching. So when a healthy-looking person has a heart attack, stress and sleep are often part of what hindsight uncovers. Perhaps not as the only reason, and not as some vague excuse, but as the hidden strain that helped shape blood pressure, inflammation, metabolic function, and daily resilience over years. The person looked fine because most people do, right up until the body's quieter accounting becomes loud enough to interrupt everything. And once that is clear, another problem comes into view, because many people trust visible fitness almost as much as they trust visible health, when in reality, even being active and apparently in good shape can still leave important cardiovascular risk hiding in plain sight. There is something very reassuring about fitness, and that reassurance is not entirely irrational. A body that moves well, carries itself with strength, recovers from effort, and can tolerate exertion is usually healthier in many important ways than a body that cannot. Physical activity lowers cardiovascular risk, improves blood pressure, helps the body manage blood sugar and insulin, supports healthier weight regulation, can reduce C-reactive protein, and lowers the risk of heart disease compared with inactivity. In other words, fitness matters very much. The problem is not that fitness is unimportant. The problem is that people often ask it to stand in for too many other things at once. The word fit is doing far too much work in ordinary conversation. Sometimes it means active, sometimes it means lean, sometimes it means muscular, sometimes it means athletic, Sometimes it means young enough to run upstairs without having to negotiate with the staircase halfway through. None of these meanings is useless, but none of them by itself tells you whether a person's coronary arteries are free of plaque, whether their blood pressure is controlled, whether their cholesterol burden has been favourable for the past 20 years, whether their blood sugar is creeping upward, or whether they are carrying inherited risk that exercise alone cannot erase. The American Heart Association's Life's Essential 8 makes this point in a quietly practical way by listing physical activity as only one part of cardiovascular health, alongside sleep, weight, cholesterol, blood sugar, blood pressure, diet, and nicotine exposure. Fitness counts. It simply does not count as the whole story. This is where many people get into trouble, because visible fitness is such a persuasive form of evidence. A person who runs, cycles, lifts weights, hikes, swims, or generally behaves as though their body is still a willing collaborator inspires confidence. They look unlike the stereotype of cardiovascular risk. They may inspire the sentence, "He's so fit," or "She's the healthy one," which is often meant kindly and is sometimes medically misleading. The body, unfortunately, is capable of holding two truths at once. Someone can be functionally fit and still be developing coronary disease. Atherosclerosis does not ask whether a person owns a gym membership before deciding whether LDL particles may enter the artery wall. It responds to cumulative exposure, vascular biology, inflammation, blood pressure, metabolism, genetics, and time. Fitness can improve many of those influences, but it does not erase them by declaration. That distinction matters because physical activity genuinely lowers risk. But lowering risk is not the same thing as eliminating it. NHLBI states that physically active people are less likely to develop heart disease than the inactive people, and that regular activity helps manage other risk factors such as blood pressure, blood sugar, and inflammation. That is all excellent news, yet the same broad preventive frameworks from NHLBI and the AHA treat physical activity as one risk-reducing behaviour among several, not as a complete substitute for knowing one's blood pressure, cholesterol, blood sugar, weight pattern, sleep habits, and family history. A person can therefore be doing one major thing right and still have another major problem quietly developing. One very common misunderstanding is to confuse being lean with being metabolically safe. Body size, especially when reduced to the blunt instrument of ordinary visual judgment, tells you less than people imagine. Some individuals with a normal body mass index carry relatively high body fat, particularly centrally, along with insulin resistance, adverse lipid patterns, or higher blood pressure. This pattern is often referred to as normal weight obesity, which sounds slightly accusatory, but describes a real metabolic phenomenon. A 2022 systematic review and meta-analysis found that normal weight obesity was associated with higher odds of dyslipidemia, hypertension, and metabolic syndrome, and concluded that BMI alone is inadequate for better obesity-related risk assessment. Earlier NIH-hosted work likewise found that normal weight obesity is associated with cardiometabolic dysregulation, and in women, independently associated with increased cardiovascular mortality. So the apparently slim person is not automatically the lower risk person if their metabolic profile is quietly unfavourable. That is one reason fit can be misleading. People use it partly as a visual category. They look at body shape and infra-arterial health. But cardiovascular risk lives partly in measurements, not appearances. Blood pressure can be elevated in someone who looks athletic. Blood sugar can be drifting into prediabetes in someone who has visible abs and no patience for elevators. LDL cholesterol can be high in a person who can run 10 kilometers and tell you all about their resting heart rate. Family history can be quietly working in the background regardless of how disciplined the person appears on a bicycle. The American Heart Association's Life's Essential 8 includes weight, cholesterol, blood sugar, and blood pressure, precisely because cardiovascular health is not reducible to what the body looks like in motion or at rest. There is another version of this problem among people who are genuinely very active and highly trained. Here the misunderstanding is not just visual but physiological. If someone has strong cardiorespiratory fitness, surely that must mean their arteries are cleaner, safer, and fundamentally protected. Often fitness does help. A large 2018 circulation study found that cardiovascular events decreased with increasing cardiorespiratory fitness across coronary calcium categories, and each additional emet of fitness was associated with lower event risk. That is important and reassuring. Higher fitness is protective, but the same body of work also treats coronary artery calcium and fitness as independent predictors, not interchangeable ones. High fitness does not make coronary calcium cease to matter. It means the fitter person may do better than a less fit person with similar calcium burden, not that the burden disappears because the treadmill test was impressive. This is where the conversation becomes slightly uncomfortable for very committed exercisers. Several studies over the past decade have suggested that very high levels of lifelong endurance exercise do not necessarily produce a more favourable coronary plaque profile than an active, healthy lifestyle. A 2023 study in the European Heart Journal found that lifelong endurance athletes had more coronary plaques, including more non-calcified proximal plaques, than fit and healthy non-athletes with similarly low cardiovascular risk profiles, and concluded that lifelong endurance sport participation was not associated with more favourable plaque composition. That does not mean exercise is harmful in the ordinary sense, or that people should all take to the sofa with a biscuit in a spirit of cardiovascular protest. It means that very high performance and ideal-looking arterial biology are not guaranteed to travel together. The nuance matters here. One should not leap from that finding to the melodramatic conclusion that exercise causes heart attacks, or that endurance athletes are secretly doomed. Other data suggest that high-volume exercise is not associated with progression of coronary artery calcification in community-dwelling adults initially free of overt cardiovascular disease, and a 2025 study reported that high-volume physical activity was associated with lower all-cause mortality, even though the risk for clinical coronary artery disease was similar to low-volume activity, and coronary calcium still predicted higher clinical CAD risk regardless of activity level. The picture, then, is not that fitness becomes dangerous so much as that fitness does not grant exemption from atherosclerosis, especially once calcium or plaque is present. That is a more sober and much more useful conclusion. It also helps explain why active, outwardly healthy people can still have frightening events. The heart attack is not checking whether the person completed a half marathon last autumn. It is responding to what is present in the coronary arteries at that moment. If there is plaque, if that plaque is inflamed or unstable, if blood pressure, lipid burden, genetics, clotting tendency, or metabolic strain have been shaping the vessel wall unfavourably, then high fitness may reduce overall odds without reducing them to zero. This is emotionally difficult because people like simple moral arithmetic. We prefer a world in which running 3 times a week purchases total immunity from invisible biological processes. But the artery wall is not a loyalty program. It is tissue responding to conditions over time. One of the more misleading forms of fitness is performance fitness. A person may be very capable at a chosen activity and still have gaps elsewhere in cardiovascular health. Someone can be excellent at cycling and have poorly controlled LDL cholesterol. Someone can lift very heavy things and sleep terribly. Someone can look good in a fitted shirt and have blood pressure that would be less impressive if written down. Someone can train hard enough to create the outward identity of an athlete and still rely on denial for the inward identity of a patient in waiting. None of this diminishes the real benefits of exercise. It only reminds us that a single strength does not cancel all weaknesses. That is also why clinicians like measurements so much. Measurements are annoyingly literal, which is precisely their value. Fitness is partly observable, risk often is not. Blood pressure can be measured, lipids can be measured, blood sugar can be measured, coronary calcium can be imaged in selected patients. family history can be taken, sleep apnea can be assessed. These are ways of correcting the illusion created by surface impressions. NHLBI's risk framework for coronary heart disease makes clear that family history, poor sleep, physical inactivity, unhealthy habits, and conditions such as high cholesterol, diabetes, and hypertension all matter. A fit-looking person may score well on one axis and poorly on another. Without checking, no one knows which axis will prove more decisive. There is also the category of people who are fit enough to be underestimated. They may not be elite athletes, but they are active enough that symptoms are explained away more readily. They still exercise, they still function, they can still work through chest discomfort, breathlessness, or unusual fatigue and tell themselves they are only tired, stressed, or slightly off form. This is one of the crueler ways fitness can mislead. It creates confidence not only in observers, but in the person themselves. If they can still do the workout, then surely the heart must be fine. Yet early coronary disease and even exertional symptoms can coexist with surprisingly good functional ability, especially in determined people who are skilled at normalizing their discomfort. Being fit can also hide deterioration, because fit people often begin from a higher level of performance. A modest decline may not look like illness, it may look like a bad week, aging, stress, poor sleep, or a little less enthusiasm than usual. A previously strong runner who is slowing down might still be faster than everyone around them. A cyclist who feels oddly heavy-legged may still seem impressive to anyone watching. A physically capable person with emerging coronary disease may therefore cross a long stretch of reduced reserve before anyone interprets it correctly. Fitness in that sense can delay recognition because the baseline was high enough to absorb some loss without public embarrassment. Then there is the cultural side of the problem. Fitness has become a kind of moral language. People associate it with discipline, competence, self-care, and control. That is not always wrong, but it creates a subtle bias in medical thinking and ordinary thinking alike. The fit person is presumed lower risk because they do everything right. The less fit person is presumed higher risk because the story feels easier. Biology is not obliged to follow that script. A fit person may have inherited elevated lipoprotein, A, familial hypercholesterolemia, early coronary calcium, or a plaque burden built during years before their current habits improved. An unfit person may, for the moment, have fewer dangerous plaques than assumed. The aim is not to romanticize either situation. It is simply to stop using fitness as a shortcut for arterial innocence. The most helpful way to think about fitness is as an asset rather than a verdict. It improves resilience. It lowers risk. It often softens the impact of other problems. It helps blood pressure, insulin sensitivity, weight control, inflammation, mental health, and quality of life. NHLBI explicitly notes these benefits, and the AHA's broader cardiovascular health model gives physical activity a central role for good reason. But an asset is not a guarantee. A strong roof does not mean the foundation never needs inspecting. A good engine does not tell you whether something unfortunate is happening inside the fuel line. Fitness is part of cardiovascular health, not a substitute for it. That distinction becomes even sharper once coronary calcium enters the picture. Coronary artery calcium is evidence of atherosclerosis. The AHA notes that calcium scoring can help evaluate risk in selected people, especially when a stronger understanding of hidden coronary disease is needed. In studies of physical activity and fitness, calcium remains meaningful even in active people. Higher fitness may improve prognosis, but a person with calcium still has documented atherosclerotic disease in a way the person with a score of 0 does not. That is not a moral judgment. It is a structural one. The arteries are telling a story that the body's outward performance may not have revealed. So when fit is used as reassurance, it should be used carefully. Fit people are often healthier than unfit people, in broad population terms. That remains true. But the healthy direction of the average does not protect every individual from hidden risk. A person can be fit and still have hypertension, fit and still have inherited lipid disorders, fit and still have coronary plaque, fit and still sleep too little, recover poorly, or live under chronic stress, fit and still be one blood test, one coronary calcium scan, or one bad emergency room evening away from discovering that their visible strength had been telling only half the story. And once that is clear, another uncomfortable reality comes into focus, because when fitness and visible health are no longer enough to reassure us, we're left with the question of what actually warns people before a heart attack, and the answer, rather inconveniently, is that the body often does try to signal trouble, just not always in the dramatic, unmistakable form people expect, or in the pattern they are willing to recognize in time. By the time many people realize they may be having a heart attack, the body has often been trying to get their attention for longer than they appreciate. The difficulty is not always that there were no warning signs. Quite often the difficulty is that the warning signs did not arrive in the dramatic, unmistakable, chest-clutching style people have been trained to expect. The public image of a heart attack is very narrow. Sudden crushing chest pain, immediate collapse, instant certainty. Real events can look like that, but they do not have to. Symptoms vary widely. Some people have severe symptoms, some have mild ones, and some have no symptoms they recognize as cardiac at all. Some heart attacks happen suddenly, but many begin with warning signs and symptoms hours, days, or even weeks in advance. The most common warning sign is still chest discomfort, and that matters because people sometimes overcorrect once they hear about atypical symptoms. They begin to imagine that chest pain no longer matters, when in fact it very much does. The American Heart Association says most people having a heart attack feel discomfort in the center of the chest, and it can feel like pressure, squeezing, fullness, or pain. Mayo Clinic describes it as pressure, tightness, pain, squeezing, or aching. What confuses people is that this discomfort does not always behave with theatrical consistency. It may last more than a few minutes, or it may go away and come back. That stop and start pattern can be especially misleading, because intermittent symptoms feel easier to dismiss than continuous ones. That returning pattern matters more than many people realize. If someone has recurring chest pressure that appears with activity, stress, or even at rest and does not feel normal for them, that may be part of the warning period rather than a false alarm. Mayo Clinic notes that chest pain or pressure that keeps happening and does not go away with rest can be an early warning sign, often related to temporary reductions in blood flow known as angina. This is one reason hindsight features so heavily in heart attack stories. People remember that there had been episodes before. There had been a strange heaviness climbing stairs, an odd pressure while walking, a discomfort after stress, a feeling in the chest that seemed too brief or too inconvenient to count. The body had been speaking, just not in a way that forced belief at the time. Another reason warning signs are missed is that the discomfort does not have to stay in the chest. Pain or pressure may spread to the shoulder, one or both arms, the back, neck, jaw, teeth, or even the upper belly. The American Heart Association includes the arms, back, neck, jaw, and stomach among the other areas where discomfort may appear. Mayo Clinic similarly notes that upper body pain may spread to the shoulder, arm, back, neck, jaw, teeth, or upper belly, and some people have upper body pain without chest discomfort at all. That last detail is particularly important. Once the chest is removed from the story, people start calling the experience something else. They call it muscle strain, trapped gas, poor posture, a bad pillow, an unlucky sandwich, or stress from sitting in a car too long. The symptom is real. The interpretation goes wandering. Shortness of breath is another sign people routinely underestimate because it feels so non-specific. Breathlessness seems ordinary enough to belong to anxiety, aging, poor sleep, mild illness, a hill, an argument, or a general failure to have become a more elegant mammal. Yet the American Heart Association lists shortness of breath as a key warning sign and notes that it can happen with or without chest discomfort. Mayo Clinic says some people may feel as though they are gasping or trying to take deep breaths. If a person becomes unexpectedly short of breath, especially with exertion they normally tolerate, that deserves more respect than it usually gets. The warning does not become less cardiac simply because it is vaguer than a film script would prefer. Then there are the symptoms people most like to explain away because they fit too many other harmless stories. Nausea, vomiting, indigestion, heartburn, sweating, lightheadedness, and unusual fatigue are all listed by major medical sources as possible heart attack symptoms. The AHA includes nausea, cold sweat, feeling lightheaded, rapid or irregular heartbeat, and feeling unusually tired. Mayo Clinic adds indigestion or heartburn, nausea, sweating, fatigue, and dizziness. The problem is not that these symptoms are rare. The problem is that they are common in other situations too. The body, in effect, is using a set of warning lights that can also come on for much less dangerous reasons, and people naturally choose the explanation that lets them continue their day. Fatigue deserves special attention because it is one of the least dramatic and most easily ignored warning signs in medicine. People accept fatigue the way they accept weather or bureaucracy. They assume it is part of modern life. But unusual tiredness, especially if it is new out of proportion or paired with other symptoms, can be part of the picture. The American Heart Association specifically lists unusual tiredness and weakness among symptoms women may experience during a heart attack, and Mayo Clinic includes fatigue among common symptoms more broadly. This is one of the reasons apparently healthy people can miss warning signs for so long. A fit, active, responsible person may become oddly tired and simply tell themselves they need a weekend, a vitamin, or fewer emails. The heart, meanwhile, may be making a more serious point. Women are especially likely to be underserved by the popular image of heart attack symptoms. The important nuance here is not that women do not get chest discomfort. They often do. Both the AHA and NHLBI state that chest pain or discomfort remains the most common heart attack symptom in women as well as in men. But women are more likely to have accompanying or less classic symptoms such as shortness of breath, nausea, vomiting, upset stomach, pain in the shoulder, back, or arm, unusual fatigue, weakness, neck pain, throat pain, or upper back pressure. The AHA notes that some women describe upper back pressure that feels like squeezing or like a rope being tied around them. When this symptom pattern is broader and less obviously cardiac in the public imagination, recognition can be slower. That does not mean women have mysterious or completely different hearts. It means symptom patterns overlap, but the edges matter. NHLBI notes that the location and type of pain may differ from person to person, and that women may have pain in the chest or the neck and throat. It also notes that mental stress is more likely to trigger angina pain in women than in men. Mayo Clinic says women may be more likely to have symptoms while resting or sleeping, and may have neck, jaw, shoulder, upper back, or upper stomach discomfort, nausea, sweating, lightheadedness, or unusual fatigue. These are not obscure details. They're exactly the sort of details that change whether someone decides they're having a bad evening or a medical emergency. Older adults and people with diabetes are another group in whom warning signs may be less classic or less easy to recognize. A systematic review on atypical presentations found that atypical symptoms are more common among older adults, women, and people with diabetes, among others. Diabetes is especially relevant because changes in nerve function may blunt classic pain patterns, making symptoms vaguer or quieter. Mayo Clinic's silent heart attack summary also lists diabetes among the risk factors associated with silent or minimally recognized heart attacks. This does not mean that people with diabetes never have chest pain. Many do. It means the absence of a classic dramatic pain pattern should not reassure anyone too quickly in a person whose risk profile already includes diabetes or older age. The phrase silent heart attack sounds almost poetic, which is unfortunate because the reality is not poetic at all. Mayo Clinic defines a silent heart attack as one with few symptoms, no symptoms, or symptoms not recognized as a heart attack. It may not cause the chest pain or shortness of breath people typically associate with myocardial infarction. Some people think they had heartburn, the flu, or a strained chest muscle. The heart muscle, regrettably, does not benefit from these alternate explanations. A silent heart attack is still a heart attack, still involves blocked blood flow, and still increases the risk of later events and complications such as heart failure. This is one of the clearest reasons warning signs are missed. Sometimes the warning never feels dramatic enough to earn the right category in the person's mind. Another trap is that heart attack symptoms can overlap with panic, reflux, viral illness, overexertion, or muscular discomfort. Mayo Clinic explicitly notes that some people may feel anxiety or a sense of doom, heartburn or indigestion, dizziness, nausea, or upper body pain without chest discomfort. These overlaps are part of why people delay. If chest pain is accompanied by sweating and fear, some interpret the whole thing as a panic attack. If discomfort is high in the stomach, they call it indigestion. If the pain is in the back or shoulder, they blame posture or lifting. Sometimes they are right. The problem is that when they are wrong, the cost of waiting is measured in threatened heart muscle. Delay is one of the most dangerous features of this entire subject. The AHA says not to wait to get help if warning signs appear and specifically advises calling 911 if you have any symptoms of heart attack. It emphasizes that even if you are not sure it is a heart attack, you should get checked out. Minutes matter. Fast action can save lives. This urgency is not merely organizational enthusiasm. It reflects the biology of heart muscle under reduced blood flow. The longer the artery stays blocked, the greater the risk of irreversible damage. People often delay because they are waiting for certainty, and certainty is exactly what the symptom pattern may refuse to provide. One of the reasons official advice insists on calling emergency services rather than driving oneself is that transport is not just transportation. The AHA notes that arriving by ambulance may lead to faster treatment at the hospital, and that EMS can begin treatment on arrival and provide resuscitation if needed. That is an important practical point because many people still think of the decision mainly as hospital or no hospital. In reality, it is also monitored professional response or improvised private journey, while hoping nothing deteriorates in traffic. A person who tries to be stoic, independent, or merely polite in this situation is taking a risk that the heart does not admire. There is also the problem of repetition. People often imagine that a heart attack warning sign should be one overwhelming experience, but symptoms may come in waves, appear with activity and ease with rest, or recur over hours or days before the final event. Mayo Clinic notes that some heart attacks start slowly with mild pain or discomfort, and that chest pain may keep happening as an early warning sign. The AHA likewise says some events are sudden and intense while others start slowly. This pattern is medically important and psychologically treacherous. Anything that comes and goes feels less urgent than something that stays and intensifies. The body is, unfortunately, under no obligation to make its warnings emotionally convenient. The social setting matters too. Symptoms are often filtered through whoever else is present. A spouse says it is probably reflux. A friend says it sounds like stress. A colleague says perhaps you just need to sit down for a minute. The person experiencing the symptoms usually wants that reassurance to be true, because the alternative is disruptive, frightening, and deeply inconvenient. This is one reason the warning signs go unrecognized even when they are not especially subtle. Recognition is not only biological, it is social and emotional. People compare what they feel against what they expected a heart attack to feel like, and if the match is imperfect, they downgrade the threat. That mismatch is especially strong in people who identify themselves as healthy, fit, or too young for heart trouble. They often use those identities as evidence against what the body's doing in real time. The reasoning becomes, this cannot be my heart because I am not the kind of person this happens to. The symptom is then interpreted through a safer category. The chest pressure becomes stress. The breathlessness becomes poor sleep. The upper back discomfort becomes muscle tension. The nausea becomes lunch. The tiredness becomes overwork. The category of heart attack remains reserved for someone older, less active, more obviously at risk. Biology does not honour that reservation system. There is another less discussed problem, which is that some warning signs are not painful at all. People may feel weakness, unusual tiredness, breathlessness, clamminess, or just a sense that something is wrong. Mayo Clinic notes that symptoms can include fatigue, shortness of breath, lightheadedness, nausea, and sweating. The AHA includes feeling unusually tired, lightheaded, or suddenly breaking out in a cold sweat. These are not the kind of symptoms that naturally produce a dramatic story. They're easy to domesticate, yet a cluster of vague symptoms occurring together, especially in someone with risk factors or new exertional intolerance, deserves much more suspicion than people usually give it. What makes all this so difficult is that there is no single perfectly reliable symptom profile. Some people have textbook chest pressure radiating into the left arm. Some have chest discomfort plus nausea and sweating. Some have jaw pain and shortness of breath. Some have upper back pressure and unusual fatigue. Some have little warning before collapse. The point is not to create panic around every unpleasant sensation. The point is to understand that heart attacks are often recognised late because people wait for a symptom script that reality does not consistently use. Official medical guidance reflects that variability very clearly. Symptoms vary. Some people have no symptoms, women often have less classic associated symptoms, and silent heart attacks may be missed entirely. So the warning signs we do not always recognise are not necessarily hidden in some exotic medical sense. More often they are hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary discomforts, everyday fatigue, indigestion, muscle pain, anxiety, bad sleep, stress, overwork, or simply the refusal to believe the heart could be the source. The body may be sending signals, the mind may be filing them under something less alarming. That is why this subject matters so much in a video about healthy people still having heart attacks. The outwardly healthy person is often especially skilled at misreading their own symptoms because the idea of serious coronary trouble does not fit their self-image. And once that possibility is taken seriously, the final question is no longer just what danger looks like when it arrives, but what the body actually needs over the long run if a heart is to remain as protected as possible, rather than merely looking healthy from a distance. By this point, the idea of a healthy heart probably looks less simple than it did at the beginning. That is not a bad thing. It is less comforting in the lazy sense, but more comforting in the useful one. A healthy heart does not merely need a healthy-looking person attached to it. It needs favourable conditions, repeated over time. It needs arteries that are not being quietly injured year after year. It needs blood pressure that is not too high too often. It needs cholesterol levels that do not keep feeding plaque. It needs blood sugar that is reasonably controlled. It needs sleep, movement, and recovery. It needs not to be smoked into a state of irritated compliance. It needs, in some people, the extra protection of medication. And above all, it needs to be understood as something more concrete than an image, a body type, or a vague feeling that one is probably fine. That is very close to the way major prevention guidance now frames cardiovascular health. Not as a single trait, but as a cluster of measurable and modifiable conditions, including diet, physical activity, nicotine exposure, sleep, body weight, blood lipids, blood glucose, and blood pressure. That last point matters because people often ask the heart for the wrong kind of proof. They ask it to reassure them through appearance or stamina or youth, or the occasional normal blood test they had 5 years ago and have emotionally converted into a lifetime warranty. The heart is asking for something much less glamorous and much more practical. It wants consistency. It wants fewer harmful exposures and more favourable ones. It wants the risk factors that can be changed to be taken seriously, and the ones that cannot be changed to be recognised early rather than discovered after the fact. NHLBI's guidance on heart-healthy living puts it very plainly. Understanding your risk, making healthy choices, and taking steps to reduce your chances of heart disease can lower the risk of coronary disease and heart attack. So what does a healthy heart really need in everyday life? It needs a person to stop thinking in absolutes. Perfection is not required. Purity is not required. No cardiologist in the world is asking for a life free of cake, stress, weather, travel delays, family arguments, or those evenings when dinner becomes a collection of unrelated snacks because the day went wrong. What the heart needs is not theatrical virtue. It needs repeated advantage. A generally heart-healthy pattern of living lowers the odds that the vessel wall will be exposed to the sort of long-term damage that allows plaque to form, inflame, and eventually become dangerous. CDC says healthy habits help keep blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood sugar levels normal and lower the risk of heart disease and heart attack, while NHLBI's Living with Coronary Disease guidance emphasizes heart-healthy foods, physical activity, quality sleep, healthy weight, and checking blood pressure and cholesterol. Diet belongs near the center of that picture, though not in the scolding way people often fear. The heart is not improved by nutritional melodrama. It does not need a person to become a minor prophet of seed oils or to treat lunch as a moral referendum. What it does need is a pattern of eating that supports healthier blood pressure, lipids, blood sugar, and body composition over the long run. The American Heart Association recommends a heart-healthy diet that includes fruits and vegetables, whole grains, beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds, while limiting added sugar, salt, and fried foods. That sort of pattern matters not because a single meal transforms an artery, but because years of ordinary meals help shape the chemical environment the arteries live in every day. Movement matters in the same cumulative way. The heart needs regular physical activity not as punishment, not as compensation, and not as a stage set for social media, but because active bodies tend to handle cardiovascular regulation better than sedentary ones. NHLBI states that regular physical activity lowers the risk of heart disease, helps manage blood pressure and blood sugar, supports healthier weight, and can reduce inflammation. WHO recommends that adults get at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity a week, or 75 minutes of vigorous activity, or an equivalent combination, along with muscle strengthening work on 2 or more days a week. This is one of the clearest examples of the heart wanting steadiness rather than heroics. It benefits far more from regular movement than from occasional acts of athletic repentance. At the same time, and this has been one of the running themes of the whole story, the heart needs more than fitness. It needs measurements. A person can be active and still carry high LDL cholesterol, elevated lipoprotein A, rising blood sugar, or blood pressure that has been drifting upward while everyone admires their step count. That is why a healthy heart needs routine care, not just admirable habits. Blood pressure needs checking, cholesterol needs checking, blood sugar needs checking, family history needs asking about properly rather than vaguely. The AHA's Life's Essential 8 framework includes blood lipids, blood glucose, and blood pressure for a reason, and CDC emphasizes taking charge of medical conditions such as high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and diabetes to lower heart disease risk. Cholesterol in particular deserves more respect than it often gets, perhaps because people get tired of hearing about it and begin to treat it like background noise. But the heart needs LDL cholesterol to be kept at levels that do not keep feeding plaque formation in the arterial wall. For some people, healthy eating and physical activity help substantially. For others, especially those with inherited disorders or higher baseline risk, medication becomes part of what the heart really needs. NHLBI states that statins are the most common medicines used to treat high blood cholesterol, and that studies have shown statins lower the risk of heart attack and stroke in people with high LDL cholesterol. That is not a failure of lifestyle, it is simply using the tools that match the biology actually present. The same practicality applies to blood pressure. A healthy heart needs arteries that are not being repeatedly strained by pressure that is too high. CDC notes that high blood pressure raises the risk of heart disease, heart attack, and stroke, and its 2025 summary defines high blood pressure as 130/80 millimeters of mercury or higher. This is one reason prevention cannot rely on symptoms. Blood pressure may rise quietly, the person may feel ordinary, their life may continue in full administrative detail. The vessel wall, however, keeps a record. The heart needs that number taken seriously before it has had years to help damage the arteries. Blood sugar belongs in the same group of quiet but decisive influences. A healthy heart needs glucose metabolism that is not steadily damaging the vascular environment. CDC notes that diabetes raises the risk of heart disease, and that having both diabetes and high blood pressure greatly increases the risk. It also describes prediabetes as a serious condition that raises the risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. This is a good example of the heart asking for attention before drama. The body would much prefer that blood sugar problems be noticed at the stage where they're still a warning rather than a complication. Then there is smoking, which remains one of the clearest examples of something the heart does not need and has never needed, despite a century of marketing, denial, and cinematic insistence. Cigarette smoking injures the cardiovascular system in ways that are direct, cumulative, and remarkably unhelpful. The good news, and it is genuinely good, is that the heart begins to benefit when smoking stops. CDC says quitting smoking is one of the most important actions people can take to improve heart health. It also notes that 1 to 2 years after quitting, the risk of heart attack drops sharply, and after 15 years the risk of coronary heart disease falls close to that of someone who does not smoke. That is a rare and beautiful thing in biology, a major risk factor that remains powerfully worth changing even after years of exposure. Sleep, which people so often treat as optional, is not optional from the heart's point of view. It does not need a person to achieve an aesthetic of perfect bedtime serenity, but it does need enough quality sleep for blood pressure, metabolic regulation, hormonal signaling, and recovery to function more favorably. The American Heart Association's recent sleep statement says suboptimal sleep raises the risk for cardiovascular disease and is linked with higher blood pressure, blood sugar, and cholesterol levels. CDC likewise notes that adults generally need at least 7 hours of sleep, and that people who sleep less than that are more likely to report health problems, including heart attack. In other words, a healthy heart needs rest that is real, not just the theatrical kind where someone is technically in bed while mentally continuing Tuesday. It also needs some respect for stress, though not in the overly mystical way that turns every inconvenience into a coronary omen. The heart does not need a perfectly peaceful life. That would rule out most of civilization and almost all customer service. What it does need is not to live for years in a state of unrelieved strain without recovery. NHLBI notes that stress can tighten arteries and indirectly raise coronary heart disease risk through its effects on behavior, while the AHA links chronic stress and poor mental well-being with worse heart health. The heart needs room to come back down. It needs a nervous system that is not being asked to act like an emergency siren from dawn to midnight. It needs enough margin in life for the body to stop bracing all the time. A healthy heart also needs honesty about inherited risk. Some people need earlier or more careful attention not because they have failed, but because they have inherited biology that is less forgiving. Strong family history, familial hypercholesterolemia, or elevated lipoprotein A can shift the whole preventive picture. NHLBI notes that elevated LPA is linked to heart attack and stroke and is largely inherited. An earlier NIH and AHA guidance emphasised that family history is a real cardiovascular risk factor, not merely an old family anecdote. So what a healthy heart really needs in those people is not reassurance based on appearances. It needs earlier screening, more serious conversation, and sometimes more aggressive management of the risks that can be changed. This is where medication often deserves a kinder interpretation than it usually gets. Many people still treat the need for medication as evidence that they somehow did health incorrectly. But if a person has significant LDL elevation, hypertension, diabetes, or another strong risk factor, the heart may genuinely need help that lifestyle alone cannot reliably provide. That is not defeat. It is prevention growing up and becoming specific. NHLBI's cholesterol treatment guidance makes clear that statins reduce heart attack and stroke risk in people with high LDL cholesterol, and CDC's heart disease prevention guidance emphasises taking charge of medical conditions rather than simply hoping a generally decent lifestyle will negotiate with them on your behalf. There is another thing the heart needs, and it is less discussed because it does not sound like a nutrient or a lab value. It needs attention when something changes. New chest pressure, reduced exercise tolerance, unusual breathlessness, unexplained fatigue, recurrent discomfort in the chest, jaw, back or arms, sudden sweats, nausea, or the sense that something is wrong should not be waved away just because the person is fit, busy, or not the type. The whole lesson of this video has been that the heart does not arrange its warnings to suit our assumptions. A healthy heart is not one that never produces symptoms. It is one whose early signals, risk factors, and hidden vulnerabilities are taken seriously enough that catastrophe becomes less likely. The AHA and Mayo Clinic both emphasise that heart attack symptoms vary widely, and that some heart attacks begin with warning signs hours, days, or even weeks before the event. In the end, what a healthy heart really needs is not a perfect person. It needs a person willing to move beyond appearances. It needs someone who understands that health is not a costume, fitness is not immunity, and feeling well is not always the same as being protected. It needs daily habits that tilt the odds in the right direction, numbers that are known rather than guessed, inherited risk that is acknowledged rather than romanticised away, and symptoms that are respected before they become emergencies. That is a quieter idea of health than the one most people grow up with, but it is a sturdier one. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to leave the subject tonight. Not with the promise that the body can be made risk-free, because it cannot, but with the much more useful truth that the heart usually asks for the same things over and over again: less damage, more stability, earlier attention, and a life arranged not around looking healthy from a distance, but around giving the arteries, the blood vessels, and the faithful muscle at the centre of it all the kind of conditions in which staying quietly alive becomes, for as long as possible, the easiest thing in the world,